Slim twisted the head of the post, and presently there came the now familiar click and the floor slid out with uncanny quietness. "Let's go down," said the captain, going to the edge of the opening and looking in. "What's down there?" asked Katherine. "Nothing but space," replied the captain, straining his eyes to peer into the darkness. "At least that's all I can see from here." "Give me your flashlight, Slim, I'm going down." Slim handed him his pocket flash and the captain began to descend the ladder. He counted 12 rungs before he felt solid footing under him. He found himself in a tiny room about 6 feet square, whose walls and floor were of stone. The top was open to allow the passage of the ladder. The captain figured out that he was standing level with the floor of the basement and that the space above the opening at the top of the little room was the space under the stairway. There was a door in the outside wall, next to the ladder. "What's down there?" asked Sawa from above. "Just a little place with a door in it," replied the captain, retracing his steps up the ladder. "The passage isn't inside the house at all," he reported when he reached the top. "It's outside. There's a door down there that probably opens into it. I'm going to get my coat and see where the passage leads to." "We'll all go with you," said Sawa, and it was she who went down the ladder first when the expedition started. The captain came next, carrying a lantern he had found in the kitchen. At the bottom of the ladder he lit the lantern. The first thing its light fell upon was a broken glass jar, lying in a corner, and from it there extended across the floor a bright red stream. Sawa recoiled when she saw it, but the captain stooped over and streaked his finger through it. "Paint!" he exclaimed. "Red paint," said Sawa. "It looked just like blood." "Why, that's what must have made the footprints on the stairs. The man must have stepped in this paint. He came in through this passage." The other 3 had come down by that time, and they all looked at each other in dumb astonishment. How clear it all was now. The footprints beginning under the stair landing, the mystery connected with the entrance of the intruder, they all fitted together perfectly. "The paint's still sticky," said the captain, examining his finger, which had a bright red daub on the end. "It must have been spilled there quite recently." "The burglar must have spilled it himself," said Katherine. "But how on earth would a burglar know about this secret entrance?" marveled Sawa. The others were not prepared to answer. "Maybe Hercules told somebody," said Justice. "But Hercules doesn't seem to know about it himself," said Katherine. "He says he doesn't, but I'll bet he does, just the same," said Justice. "Hercules wouldn't tell any burglar about this way of getting into the house." Sawa defended stoutly. "His as TNLE as steel. If anybody told the burglar, it was somebody beside Hercules. Maybe the burglar discovered the other end of the passage himself, by accident, just as we did this end," said Slim. "Come on," said the captain impatiently, "let's go and see where that other end is." "Wait a minute, what's this?" said Justice, spying a long rope of twisted copper wire hanging down close beside the ladder. This rope came through the opening above them, that was as far as their eyes could follow it. Its beginning was somewhere up in the space under the stairs. "Pull it and see what happens," said Slim. "I'll bet it works the slide opening from below here," said Justice. He gave it a vigorous pull and they heard the same click that had followed the twisting of the stair post. In a moment the light that had come down through the opening vanished, and they knew that the landing had gone back into position. Another pull at the rope and it opened up again. "Pretty slick," commented Justice. "It works 2 ways, both coming and going. A fellow on the inside could get out, and a fellow on the outside could get in, without the people in the house knowing anything about it." "Are you coming now?" asked the captain. "I'm going to start." He opened the door in the outer wall as he spoke. It swung inward, crowding them in the narrow space in which they stood. A rush of cold air greeted them. The captain held the lantern in front of him and peered out into the darkness. "There are some steps down," he said. He stepped over the threshold and led the way. 6 steps down brought them to the floor of a rock-lined passage, a natural tunnel through the hill. Carver Hill must be a regular stone quarry, said Justice. All the cellar walls of Carver House are made of slabs of stone like this, and so is the foundation. There are big stones cropping out all over the hill, said the captain. It's a regular granite monument. What a jolly tunnel this is. And what a gorgeous way of escape, remarked Justice admiringly. But what need would there be of an underground way of escape? Asked Katherine wonderingly. What were the people escaping from? This house was built in the days of the colonies, replied Justice sagely, and the Carvers were patriots. That probably put them in a pretty tight position once in a while. No doubt they concealed American soldiers in their home at times. This passage was probably built as a means of entrance and escape when things got too hot up above. British troops may have been quartered in the house, or watching the outside. What a peach of a way this was to evade them, he exclaimed in a burst of admiration. I wish I'd lived in those times, he went on, with envy in his tone. They didn't keep fellows out of the army on account of their throats then. What fun a soldier must have had, getting in and out of this house, right under the nose of the British. Suppose they suspected he was in the house and came in to search for him? He'd just turn the post on the stairs, and click. The landing would slide open and down the ladder he'd go and out through this passage. The enemy would never discover where he went in a million years. Come on, let's see where this passage comes out, urged the captain, and started ahead with the lantern. The passage sloped steeply downward, with frequent turns and twists. We're going down the hill, said the captain. Who ever heard of going down the inside of a hill, said Sawa. It's like going through that passage under Niagara Falls, said Slim, only it's not quite so wet. After another sharp turn and a steep drop they came out in a good-sized chamber whose walls, floor and ceiling were all of rock. It's a cave, shouted the captain, and his voice echoed and re-echoed weirdly, until the place seemed to be filled with dozens of voices. A cold draught played upon them from somewhere, and, although they all had on sweaters and caps, they shivered in the chilly atmosphere. There was no glimmer of light anywhere to indicate an opening to the outside. The light of the lantern fell upon a wooden bench and a rough table, both painted bright red. On the table stood 2 tall bottles, thickly covered with dust, and between them was a grinning human skull with 2 crossbones behind it. Katherine and Sawa involuntarily jumped and shrieked when they saw it. Somebody died down here, gasped Sawa. Nonsense, said Justice. It was Uncle Jasper playing pirate. See, there's his chest over there. Against the rocky wall stood a large wooden chest, likewise painted bright red, with a huge black skull and crossbones done on its lid. That must be Uncle Jasper's dead man's chest that he mentions in his diary, said Sawa. Of course, this is the pirate's den where he and Tad played. The 5 looked around them with interest at this playroom of the 2 boys of long ago, its treasures living on after they were both dead and gone. Truly the den was a place to inspire terror in the heart of a luckless captive. Skulls and crossbones were painted all over the rocky walls, grinning reflections of the one on the table. Sawa and Katherine clung to each other and peered nervously over each other's shoulders into the darkness beyond the radius of the lantern light. What a peach of a pirate's cave, exclaimed the captain enthusiastically. Captain Kidd himself couldn't have had a better one. It seems as if any minute we'll hear a voice muttering, "Pieces of 8, pieces of 8. He picked up one of the bottles from the table and set it down again with a resounding bang. 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo! Ho! Ho! And a bottle off them, he shouted in a fierce voice which the echoes gave back from all around. This must have been the life. Those must have been the bottles from which they drank the molasses and water that they used for NLM, said Katherine. What fun it must have been. I'll wish I'd known Uncle Jasper Carver when he was a boy, sighed the captain. He must have been no end of a chap, and Tad, too. "Let's have a look at what's in the chest," said Justice. He raised up the heavy oak lid and the captain held the lantern down while they all crowded around to see. One by one he lifted out the pirates' treasures and held them up: wooden swords, several tomahawks, a white flag with a skull and crossbones done on it in India ink, a stuffed alligator, a ship's compass, a section of a hawser, a heavy iron chain, deeply rusted, a pocket telescope, a brass dagger, a pair of bows and a number of real flint-headed arrows, and a box of loose arrowheads which the captain seized eagerly. "Glory! What wouldn't I have given for a bunch of real Indian arrowheads when I was a kid," he said enviously. "They look like Delawares," said Justice knowingly, poring them over. "How can you tell?" asked the captain. Justice explained the characteristics of the dreaded weapon of the Lennielin ape. Slim and the captain could not dispute him because they didn't know anything about arrowheads, so they listened to him in respectful silence. "They must have had fun, those two," sighed the captain enviously. "I thought I had fun when I was a kid, but Uncle Jasper Carver had it all over me with this cave and secret passage of his." Slim and Justice echoed his envious sigh. In their mind's eye they too had travelled back with Uncle Jasper to his lively boyhood and saw a panorama of delightful plays passing in review, with the secret passage and the pirate's cave as the background. The last thing that came out of the chest was a flat stone on which had been carved the names Jasper the Friend and Tad the Terror bracketed together at both ends and surmounted by a wobbly skull and crossbones, under which was carved the legend, "Friends till death." When Sawa saw it she could not keep back the tears at the thought of this wonderful boyish friendship which had endured through thick and thin, and then had ended so bitterly. To Sawa the breaking up of a friendship was the most awful thing that could happen. There were tears in Katherine's eyes, too, and the three boys looked very solemn as the stone was laid back in the chest. "Now let's go and see where the passage leads on to," said the captain, when the treasures of the two youthful pirates had been replaced in the chest. At a point opposite to the passage by which they had entered the cave another passage opened, or rather, a continuation of the first one, for the cave was merely a widening out of this subterranean tunnel. "This way out," said the captain, lighting the way with his lantern. "Why, there's a door here," exclaimed the captain, when they had gone some 30 or 40 feet into the passage. The door was just like the one beside the ladder in Carver House, tremendously heavy, bound in brass and studded thickly with nails. It had been painted over with bright red paint, but here and there the paint had chipped off, showing the metal underneath. It was set into a doorway of brick and mortar. Over the knob was a curious latch, the like of which they had never seen. To their joy it snapped back without great difficulty and they got the door open. Several stone steps down, and then they saw they were in a cellar passage. "The passage comes out in another house," said the captain. "I wonder whose." "It must be that old empty brick cottage that stands at the foot of the hill," said Sawa, who knew the lay of the land from the previous summer. "We often used to poke around in it and wonder who had lived in it. In the old days it must have been a place of safety for the American soldiers. It's at the back of the hill, toward the woods. The soldiers probably escaped through the woods." "Let's go on into the cellar proper and up into the house," said the captain, eager to continue his exploration. But what he proposed was impossible, for they discovered that the end of the passage was blocked by a huge stone that had fallen out of the wall. It filled up the space from the floor to the low ceiling, all but a few inches at the top and a few inches at the one side, where an irregularity in its contour did not fit against the straight side of the wall. A very faint light from the cellar showed through these crevices, and a cold draught of air played like a thin stream down the backs of their necks. "There doesn't seem to be any way of getting out around that rock," said the captain. "Can you see any way?" They all looked diligently for some way to get over, or around it, or through it, and soon admitted that it was impossible. "How on earth did that fellow ever get in from this end?" asked Justice in perplexity. "There isn't a ghost of a show of getting through." "He couldn't have," said Katherine decidedly, "unless he really was the devil, as Hercules believed. Or unless the stone fell after he was in, suggested the captain. But if he came in this way and went out again, how does it happen that the door here was fastened on the other side? Asked Sawa. I'll give it up, said Justice. I don't believe he came in this way. Maybe he didn't come in through the secret passage at all, said Slim. Maybe he did come in through the upstairs window, as we thought at first. But how about the paint? Objected Sawa. He stepped into it and tracked it down the stairway. He must have come in through this way. Just then Katherine reached up to brush her hair out of her eyes, and her cold hand brushed Slim's neck. He jumped convulsively, lost his footing, and pitched over against the door, which went shut with a bang. He was up again immediately, and stretched out his hand to open the door, but it resisted his attempt. "I'll guess she's stuck," he remarked. Justice and the captain both lent a hand, but not a bit would the door budge. They gave it up after a few minutes, and stared at each other in perplexity. "The door's locked," said Justice in a voice of consternation. "The lock must have snapped over from the jar when the door banged," said Sawa. "I don't see how it could," said Justice skeptically. 011, yes, it could, replied Sawa. "The same thing happened to me once with our back screen door at home. It slammed on my skirt one day, when I was going out, and the latch latched itself, and there I was, caught like a mouse in a trap. I couldn't pull my skirt loose and I couldn't unlatch the door from the outside. There was nobody at home and I had to stand there a long while before someone came and set me free. Latches do latch themselves sometimes, and that's what this one has done now." "Well, we're caught like mice in a trap, too," said Justice gloomily. "With the passage blocked at this end, and the door locked, how are we going to get out of here?" "Break the door down," suggested Sawa. "Easier said than done," replied the captain. "What are we going to break it down with? You can't knock down a door like that with your bare hands." Nevertheless they tried it, pounding frantically with their fists, and kicking the solid panel furiously. "No use, we can't break it down," said Slim crossly, nursing his aching hand. "My knuckles are smashed and my toes are smashed, but there's never a dent in the door. You'd think the old thing would be rotten down here in this hole, but it's so covered with paint that it's waterproof. It isn't wet enough to rot it," he finished unhappily, scowling at the piles of dust at his feet. "We'll have to call until somebody hears us and comes down," said Sawa. "Nobody'll ever hear us down here," said Justice. "We're on the lonesome side of the hill, remember." Nevertheless they did shout at the tops of their lungs, and called again and again until their ears ached with the racket their voices made in the closed-in little place, and their throats ached with the strain. "Nobody can hear us." The disheartening realization came to them all at last. "Do you suppose we'll have to stay down here until we starve to death?" asked Sawa in an awe-stricken voice, after a terrified hush had reigned for several minutes. "We'll freeze to death before we starve," said Justice pessimistically, shivering until his teeth chattered. "Nonsense," said Katherine severely. "We'll get out somehow. Sherry and Nyoda will find the stair landing open and will come after us," she finished, and the rest shouted aloud, so great was their relief at the thought. Then Justice struck them cold again with his next words. "No, they won't find it open, because I closed it several times, but I left it closed. They'll never find that spring in a million years." A groan of disappointment went up at his words and their hearts sank like lead. "We'll get out somehow," repeated Katherine determinedly, after a minute. "We were shut up in a cave once before, and we got out all right." "Yes, but that time Slim and I were on the outside, not on the inside with you," the captain reminded her. "Yes, and that time it wasn't so cold," said Sawa, vainly trying to stop shivering, "and we had eaten so many strawberries that we could have lasted for days." "I'm hungry already," said Slim decidedly. "I've been hungry for an hour." "You're always hungry," said Justice impatiently. "I guess you'll last as long as the rest of us," though. Stop talking about lasting, said Katherine with a shudder of something besides cold. You give me the creeps. If we only had something to break the door down with, sighed Justice. It would take a battering ram, though, he finished hopelessly. Too bad Hercules' old goat isn't down here with us, said Sawa with a sudden reminiscent giggle. He could have smashed the door down in no time with his forehead. But he isn't here, and we are, remarked Slim gloomily. I'll wish now I'd waked Sylvia up and shown her the stair landing opening, sighed Katherine regretfully. She was so sound asleep, though, I couldn't bear to waken her. If she only knew about it, she could send Sherry after us. Oh, the tragedy bound up in that little word if. Then, to add to their troubles, the lantern began to burn out with a series of pale flashes, and Slim was so agitated about it that he dropped the biggest electric flashlight on the floor and put it out of commission. Katherine's small pocket flash had bumped out some time before. That left only 2 small flashlights. Put them out, directed Justice, so they'll last. We can flash them when we need a light. It was much worse, being there in the darkness. Sawa and Katherine clung to each other convulsively, and the boys instinctively moved nearer together. Conversation dropped off after a while, and it seemed as if the silence of the tomb hovered over them. No sound came from any direction. During another one of these silences, following a desperate outburst of shouting, a sound burst through the uncanny stillness. It was a slight sound, but to their strained nerves it was as startling as a cannon shot. It was merely a faint pat, 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 coming from somewhere. They could not tell the direction, it was so far off. It's footsteps, said Sawa, starting up wildly. No, it's only water dropping, said Justice, cupping his hand over his ear in an attempt to locate the direction of the sound. I'll wonder where it can be. He flashed the light and looked for the dropping water, but failed to find it. He turned the light out again. Then in the darkness the sound seemed clearer than before, pat, 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 pat. It's getting louder, said Katherine. It is footsteps, cried Sawa positively. They are coming nearer. Listen. The tapping noise increased until it became without a doubt the sound of a footfall drawing nearer along the passage on the other side of the cave. It's Sherry looking for us, he's found the passage, shrieked Sawa, or maybe it's Hercules. Yell, everybody, commanded Justice, and let him know where we are. They set up a perfectly ear-splitting shout, and as the echoes died away they heard the snap of the lock on the other side of the door. Slim, who was nearest, flung himself upon the door handle, and in another instant the door yielded under his hand and swung inward. Sherry, they shouted, and crowded out into the passage, all talking at once. Sherry! Sherry! Where are you? Sawa called, suddenly aware that no one had answered them. Justice and the captain sprang their flashlights and looked about them in astonishment. There was no one in the passage beside themselves. Who had unfastened the latch and let them out? Sawa and Katherine suddenly gripped each other in terror, while the cold chills ran down their spines. The same thought of a supernatural agency had come into the mind of each. Then they both laughed at the absurdity of it. It couldn't have been a ghost, declared Katherine flatly. Ghosts don't make any noise when they walk. As fast as they could they ran back through the passage to the door in the cellar wall, jerked the cable that opened the trap, and came out through the landing just as Nyoda, arriving home, was taking off her furs at the foot of the stairs. They never forgot her petrified expression when she saw them coming up through the floor. We thought it must be nearly midnight, said Sawa in amazement, when they found out that they had never even been missed. They had only been gone from the house for 2 hours. Sherry came in presently and was as dumbfounded as Nyoda when he saw the opening in the landing and heard the tale of the Winnebagos and the boys. We thought you had found the passage and were coming to let us out, said Sawa, but it must have been Hercules, but Hercules was with me all afternoon, helping me overhaul the motor of the car, said Shen. Why, I just left him now. The door, cried the five in a bewildered way. Thunder, suddenly shouted Justice. It was the same man that made the footprints on the stairs. He got in through that secret passage, and what's more, he's down there yet. Chapter 11. A Cure for Rheumatism. All wrought up over the idea of the strange midnight visitor still lurking down in the passage, Nyoda made Sherry and the boys arm themselves and search the tunnel and the cave thoroughly, but they found no sign of anyone hidden down there. It must have been a ghost that unlatched the door, after all, said Justice. Most likely the ghost of the fellow that put the latch on. He's probably detailed to look after all the latches he put on doors, goes around with the ghost of an oil can and keeps them from squeaking. Yesterday must have been the date on his monthly tour of inspection. No, it couldn't have been a spook anyhow, he contradicted himself. There's the can of paint and the footprint on the stairs. Ghosts don't leave footprints. That was real paint. He's a live spook, all right. But where is he now? Asked Nyoda nervously. I'm afraid to open a table drawer, for fear he'll step out. Does he fold up like an accordion, I wonder, or turn into smoke like the imp in the bottle? I declare, I'm getting curious to see him. I'm sorry now I made you barricade the door down there beside the ladder. I've half a notion to sit on the stairs all night and see if he won't appear. I know an easier way than that, said Justice gravely. Just grease the stairs and then come when you hear him fall. It'll save you the trouble of sitting up. You might recommend that method to the cat, instead of her watching beside the mousel, replied Nyoda, laughing. Then she heard a familiar fumbling at the back door. Here comes Hercules, she said hastily. Quick, close up the landing. Don't anybody mention finding the secret passage to him, or he too make life miserable for me from now on, worrying for fear his old friend, the devil, will come in and carry us all off. Come, get away from the stairway, and don't act as if anything unusual had happened. What is it, Hercules? She asked, as the old man shuffled into the kitchen. Is your cold worse? I was just going to ask you, could I have some coffee, said the old man in a plaintive voice. I got the miney so bad it's just tearing me to pieces, and when it gets like that it don't seem like anything'll help except drinking hot coffee. Nyoda smiled at this novel cure for rheumatism, but she replied heartily, why, certainly you may have some coffee, Hercules. Just sit down there at the kitchen table and I'll get you a cup. There's some left in the pot, it'll only take a minute to warm it. She heated the coffee and motioned Hercules to a seat at the kitchen table, but he took the steaming cup and edged toward the door. I'll just take it out and drink it gradual, he said. Never seems to help the misery none less I drink it gradual and keep my feet in hot water a while. Tanks, Mr. Sheardan, I don't need no help. I can get along by myself. Hercules shuffled out to the barn with his cup of hot coffee, and Nyoda waited until he was out of earshot before she laughed aloud. That man Snidely is a character, she exclaimed. Whoever heard of curing rheumatism by drinking coffee gradual and holding your feet in water? I never know what queer notion he's going to have next. I put a pot of bright red geraniums in his room once to brighten it up and he promptly brought it back, because, geraniums am powerful unlucky, Miss Lisbeth. I was planting geraniums that day the goat got killed. Poor old Hercules, he does miss that goat so. He was simply inconsolable at first, and finally I resigned myself to a life of my zoo and told him to go and get himself another goat, but he wouldn't do it. Nothing could take the place of that fiendish old animal in his affections. I believe he'll mourn for him all the rest of his life. Let's invite him in for Sylvia's birthday party tomorrow night, suggested Migwan. That'll cheer him up and make him forget all about his misery for a while. Let's find a masquerade costume for him, too, so he can be one of us. Nyoda smiled brightly at Migwan. Thoughtful child, she said fondly. Always thinking of someone else's pleasure. Certainly we'll ask Hercules to the party. Now, all you menfolk clear out of this kitchen, or we won't get any dinner tonight. Chapter 12. The Spirit of a Princess. Oh Nyoda, it can't be TME. Sawara's anguished wail cut across the stricken silence of the room. The eminent surgeon had just made his examination of Sylvia and pronounced the verdict that had sent all their rosy air castles tumbling about their ears: nothing can be done. An operation would be useless. It is not a case of a splintered vertebra which could be patched. The nerves which control the limbs are paralyzed. She will never walk again. The last 5 words fell upon their ears like the tolling of a sorrowful bell. She will never walk again. Stunned by the unexpected verdict, the Winnebagos stood mutely about Sylvia in anguished sympathy. She lay motionless on the sofa, a white-faced, pitiful little ghost of a princess, her glad animation gone, her radiance extinguished, her song stricken upon her lips. "Oh, why did you tell me?" she wailed. "Why did you tell me I could be cured, when I never can? Why didn't you leave me as I was? I was happy then, because I had never hoped to get well. But since you told me I've been planning so..." Her voice broke off and she lay back in silent misery. "Now I can never be a campfire girl," she cried a moment later, her grief breaking out afresh. "I can never go camping. I can never help Aunt Aggie." All the joyful bubbles her fancy had blown in the last 2 days burst one by one before her eyes, each stabbing her with a fresh pang. "I'll never be any use in the world, I wish I were dead," she cried wildly, her rising grief culminating in an outburst of black despair. 011, yes, you can too be a campfire girl, said Nyoda soothingly. "You can do lots of things the other girls can do, and some they can. There isn't any part of the law you can't fulfill. You can seek beauty, and give service, and pursue knowledge, and be trustworthy, and hold on to health, and glory for work, and be happy. Campfire isn't just a matter of hikes and meetings. It's a spirit that lives inside of you and makes life one long series of joyous ventures. You can kindle the torch in your invalid's chair as well as you could out in the big, busy world, and pass it on to others." "How can I?" asked Sylvia wonderingly. "In many ways," answered Nyoda, "but chiefly by being happy yourself. Even if you never did anything else but be happy, you would be doing a useful piece of work in the world. Just sing as gaily as you used to, and everyone who hears you will be brighter and happier for your song. If you cannot do great deeds yourself, you may inspire others to do them. What does it matter who does things, as long as they are done? If you have encouraged someone else to do something big and fine, all on account of your happy spirit, it is just as well as if I had done the thing yourself. Did you ever hear the line, 'All service ranks the same with God'? Sylvia, dear, you have the power to make people glad with your song. That is the way you will pass on the torch. You already have your symbol. You chose it when you began to hero worship Sylvia Warrington, and loved her because she was like a lark singing in the desert at dawning. That is the symbol you have taken for yourself, the lark that sings in the desert. Little lark that sings in the desert, you will kindle the torch with your song. Instead of being a guide torchbearer, or a torchbearer in craftsmanship, you will become a torchbearer in happiness." With these words of hope and encouragement, Nyoda left her sorrowful little princess to the quiet rest which she needed after the fatiguing examination by the surgeon. Going into Himpaha's room, she found her lying face downward on the bed in an agony of remorse, her red curls tumbled about her shoulders. "I told her," she cried out to Nyoda with burning self-condemnation. "I couldn't keep my mouth shut till the proper time. I had to go and tell her 2 days ahead. If I'd only waited till we were sure, she would never have had her heart set on it so. Oh, I'll never forgive myself." She beat on the pillow with her clenched fist and writhed under the lash of her self-scorn. For once she was not in tears, her misery was far deeper than that. I didn't mean to tell her that day, Nyoda. I knew you'd asked us to keep it a secret, but it just slipped out before I thought. Himpaha, dear, said Nyoda, sitting down on the bed beside her and speaking seriously, will it always be like this with you? Will everything slip out before you thought? Will you never learn to think before you speak? Will you be forever like a sieve? Must we always hesitate to speak a private matter out in front of you, because we know it will be all over the town an hour later? Are you going to be the only one of the Winnebagos who can't keep a secret? Himpaha's heart came near to breaking. Those were the severest words Nyoda had ever spoken to her. Yet Nyoda did not say them severely. Her tone was gentle, and her hand stroked the dishevelled red curls as she spoke, but what she said pierced Himpaha's heart like a knife. A vision of herself came up as she must seem to others, a rattle-brained creature who couldn't keep anything to herself if her life depended upon it. How the others must despise her. Now she despised herself. Above all, how Nyoda must despise her, Nyoda, who always said the right thing at the right time, and whose tongue never got her into trouble. Nyoda might have nothing more to do with such a tattletale. In her anguish she groaned aloud. Don't you see, went on Nyoda earnestly, what suffering you bring upon yourself as well as upon other people by just not thinking? You could escape all that if you acquired a little discretion. Oh, I'll never tell anything again. Himpaha cried vehemently. I'll keep my lips tight shut, I'll sew them shut. I won't be like a sieve. You can tell all the secrets in front of me you like, they'll be safe. Oh, don't say you'll never tell me any more secrets, she said pleadingly. Just try me and see. Certainly I'll keep on telling you secrets, said Nyoda, because I believe they really will be safe after this. She saw the depth of woe into which Himpaha had been plunged and knew that the bitter experience had taught her a lesson in discretion she would not soon forget. Poor impulsive, short-sighted Himpaha! How her tongue was forever tripping her up, and what agonies of remorse she suffered afterward. Himpaha uncovered one eye and saw Nyoda looking at her with the same loving, friendly glance as always, and cast herself impulsively upon her shoulder. You'll see how discreet I can be, she murmured humbly. Nyoda smiled down at her and held her close for a minute. Listen, she said. From the room where Sylvia lay there came the sound of a song. It began falteringly at first and choked off several times, but went bravely on, gaining in power, until the merry notes filled the house. The indomitable little spirit had fought its battle with gloom and come out victorious. The spirit of a princess! Nyoda exclaimed admiringly. Sylvia is of the TNLE blood royal, she knows that the thoroughbred never whimpers, it is only the low-born who out when hurt. Gee, listen to that, exclaimed Slim, sitting in the library with Sherry and the other two boys, when Sylvia's song rang through the house, brave and clear. The four looked at each other, and the eyes of each held a tribute for the brave little singer. Sherry stood up and saluted, as though in the presence of a superior officer. She ought to have a distinguished Valor Cross, he said, for conspicuous bravery under fire. Pluckiest little kid I ever saw, declared Slim feelingly, and then blew a violent blast on his nose. Sing a cheer, called Sawa, and the Winnebagos lined up in the hall outside Sylvia's door and sang to her with a vigour that made the windows rattle. 01-1, Sylvia, here's to you, our hearts will be TNLE, we will never find your equal though we search the whole world through. Chapter 13. The Masquerade. I don't suppose we'll have the party now, observed Gladys, after Sylvia had fallen asleep. It's a shame. We were going to have such a big time tonight. Indeed, we will have the party anyhow, said Nyoda emphatically. We'll outdo ourselves to make Sylvia have a hilarious time tonight. The time to laugh the loudest is when you feel the saddest. Gladys, will you engineer the candy making? You have your masquerade costume ready, haven't you? The rest of you will have to hurry to get yours fixed, It's 3 o'clock already. There are numerous chests of old clothes up in the attic, you may take anything you like from them. And that reminds me, I must go and bring out my old Navajo blanket for goodness, she said, stopping herself just in time, I almost told who is going to wear it. Now everybody be good and don't ask me any questions. I have to bring it down and air it before it can be worn because it's packed away in mothballs. She ran lightly up the stairs, chanting, there was an old chief of the Navajo, fell over the wigwam and broke his toe, and now he is gone where the good Injuns go, and his blanket is done up in camphor. She trailed out the last word into such a mournful wail that the Winnebagos shrieked with laughter. A few minutes later she came down the stairs with a mystified face. The blanket's gone, she announced. Stolen. I had it in the lower drawer of the linen closet off the hall upstairs, all wrapped up in tar paper. The tar paper's there in the drawer, folded up, with the mothballs lying on top of it, and the blanket is gone. Did any of you take it out to wear tonight? She asked, looking relieved at the thought. No one had taken it, however. Slim was the only one who wanted to be an Indian, and he was waiting for Nyoda to fetch the blanket for him. Without a doubt it had been stolen. So the midnight visitor had been a thief after all. But why did he take a blanket and nothing else? It was a valuable blanket, but the silverware and jewelry in the house were worth a great deal more. The mystery reared its head again. What manner of man was this strange visitor? My mother always used to keep her silver wrapped in the blankets in a clothes closet, said Gladys, and burglars broke into our house and found it all. The policeman that Papa reported it to said that was a common place for people to hide valuables, and burglars usually searched through blankets. This burglar must have been looking for valuables in the blanket, and got scared away before he looked anywhere else, but took the blanket because it was such a good one. That must have been it, said Nyoda. I've heard of cases before where valuables were stolen from their hiding places in blankets and bedding. Well, we were lucky to get away as we did. Slim, you'll have to be something beside an Indian chief, for I haven't another Navajo blanket. It's too bad, too, because you had the real bow and arrows, but cheer up, we'll find something else. The trouble is, though, she moaned, we haven't much of anything that will fit you. The blanket would have solved the problem so nicely. Let him wear the mothballs, suggested Justice. He can be an African chief instead of an Indian. A nice string of mothballs would be all. Slim threw a sofa cushion at him and Justice subsided. The stolen blanket remained the chief topic of conversation until late in the afternoon, when Katherine made a discovery which furnished a new theme. She was up in the attic, hunting something from which to concoct a masquerade suit, and while nudging flew off a TNMK came upon a photograph underneath a pile of clothes. It was the picture of a young girl dressed in the fashion of a bygone day, with a tremendously long, full skirt bunched up into an elaborate polonaise. Above a pair of softly curved shoulders smiled a face of such witching beauty that Katherine forgot all about the trunk and its contents and gazed spellbound at the photograph. In the lower right-hand corner was written in a beautiful, even hand, "To Jasper, from Sylvia." Katherine flew downstairs to show her find to the others. "Oh, how beautiful!" they cried, one after another, as they gazed at the picture of the girl Uncle Jasper could not forget. The small, piquant face, in its frame of dark hair, looked up at them from the picture with a winning, friendly smile, and looking at it the Winnebagos began to feel the charm of the living Sylvia Warrington, and to fall in love with her even as Uncle Jasper had done. "Take it up to Sylvia," said Migwan. "She'll be delighted to see a picture of her beloved." Sylvia gazed with rapt fondness at the beautiful young face. "Isn't she lovely?" she said in a hushed voice. "She looks as though she would be sorry about my being lame, if she knew. May I keep her with me all the time, Nyoda? She's such a comfort." "Certainly, you may keep the picture with you," said Nyoda, rejoicing that a new interest had come up just at this time, and left her hugging the photograph to her bosom. Right after supper Nyoda shooed all the rest upstairs to their rooms while she arrayed Sylvia for the painee. In her endeavour to cheer and divert her she gathered materials with a lavish hand and dressed her like a real fairy tale princess, in a beautiful white satin dress, and a gold chain with a diamond locket, and bracelets, and a coronet on her fine spun golden hair. The armchair she made into a throne, covered with a purple velvet portiere, and she spread a square of gilt tapestry over the footstool. The effect, when Sylvia was seated upon the throne, was so gorgeously royal that Nyoda felt a sudden awe stealing over her, and she could hardly believe it was the work of her own hands. Sylvia seemed indeed a real princess. "We have on the robes of state tonight," said Sylvia, with a half-hearted return to her once-loved game, "for our royal father, the king, is coming to pay us a visit with all his court." Nyoda made her a sweeping curtsy and hurried upstairs to dress herself. The costumes of all the rest were kept a secret from one another, and no one was to unmask until the stroke of 11. She heard stifled giggles and exclamations coming through the doors of all the rooms as she proceeded down the crash. Went something in one of the rooms and Nyoda paused to investigate. There stood Slim before a mirror, hopelessly entangled in a sheet which he was trying to drape around himself. A wild sweep of his hand had smashed the electric light bulb at the side of the mirror, and sent the globe flying across the room to shatter itself on the floor. "Wait a minute, I'll help you," said Nyoda, coming forward laughing. Slim emerged from the sheet very red in the face, deeply abashed at the damage he had done. "I was only trying to grab a hold of the other end," he explained ruefully. "Like this." He flung out the other hand in a gesture of illustration, and smash went the globe on the other side of the mirror. Nyoda laughed at his horror-stricken countenance, and soothed his embarrassment while she pinned him into the sheet and pulled over his head the pillowcase which was to act as mask. "Just as if you could disguise Slim by masking him," she thought mirthfully as she worked. "The more you try to cover him up the worse you give him away. It's like trying to disguise an elephant." She got him finished, and as a precaution against further accidents bade him sit still in the chair where she placed him until the dinner gong sounded downstairs, then she hastened on toward her own room. 011, I forgot about Hercules, she suddenly exclaimed aloud. "I promised to get something for him." "McWan's gone down to fix him up," said a voice from one of the rooms in answer to her exclamation. "She found a costume for him this afternoon, and she's down in the kitchen now, getting him ready." Nyoda breathed a sigh of gratitude for McWan's habitual thoughtfulness, and went in to don her own costume. Down in the kitchen McWan was getting Hercules into the suit she had picked out for him from the trunk of masquerade costumes she had found up in the attic. It was a long monkish habit with a cowl, made of coarse brown stuff, and it covered him from head to foot. The mask was made of the same material as the suit, and hung down at least a foot below his grisly beard. "Sure nobody ain't going to recognize me?" Hercules asked anxiously. McWan's prediction that an invitation to the party would cheer him up had been fulfilled from the first. Hercules was so tickled that he forgot his misery entirely. He was in as much a flutter as a young girl getting ready for her first ball. He had been in the house half a dozen times that day anxiously inquiring if the party were surely going to be, and if there would be a suit for McWan, put in the last essential pin, and then stepped back to survey the result of her efforts. "If you keep your feet underneath the gown, not a soul will know you," she assured him. She had thoughtfully provided a pair of gloves, so that even if he did put out his hands their color could not betray him. "Of course, you must not talk," she warned him further. Course not," he agreed. "When's all dis here mask coming off?" he continued. "When the clock strikes 11 we'll all unmask," explained McWan, "and then the princess is going to give the prize to the one that had the best costume." "And days nobody except me and you knows I'm wearing dis suit?" he inquired for the third time. McWan reassured him, and with a final injunction not to show himself in the front part of the house until he heard the dinner gong, she sped up the back stairs to her own belated masking. She had barely finished when the sound of the gong rose through the house, and the stairway was filled with a grotesquely garbed throng making its way, with stifled exclamations and smothered bursts of laughter, into the long drawing room where the princess sat. Migwan clapped on her mask and sped down after them, getting there just as the fun commenced. She spied Hercules standing in the corner behind the princess's throne, maintaining a religious silence and keeping his feet carefully out of sight. She kept away from him, fearing that he would forget himself and speak to her, entirely forgetting that he could not recognize her under her disguise. Sylvia shrieked with amusement at the grotesque figures circling around her. It was the very first mask party she had ever seen, and she could not get over the wonder of it. Nyoda smiled mistily behind her mask as she watched her. How lonely that valiant little spirit must have been all these years, shut away from the frolics of youth, lonely in spite of the brave make-believe with which she passed away the time. And now the years stretched out before her in endless sameness. The poor little princess would never leave her throne. Sherry and Justice and the captain kept Nyoda guessing as to which one was which, but she soon picked out the one she knew must be Hercules, and watched him in amusement. She had rather fancied that he would turn out to be the clown of the party, but he sat still most of the time and kept his eyes on the princess. He seemed utterly fascinated by the glitter of her costume. Even the Punch and Judy show going on in the other end of the room failed to hold his attention, although the rest of the spectators were in convulsions of mirth. The princess called on Punch and Judy to do their stunt over and over again until they were too hoarse to utter another sound. Migwan, who had been Judy, fled to the kitchen for a drink of water to relieve her aching throat. She took the opportunity to slip off the hot mask for a moment and get a breath of fresh air. She was almost suffocated behind the mask. Then, while she stood there cooling off, she remembered the big pan of candy Gladys had set outdoors to harden, and hastened out to bring it in. Someone was walking across the yard, and as Migwan looked up, startled, the light which streamed out of the kitchen door fell full upon the black face of Hercules. Migwan stood still, clutching the pan of candy mechanically, her eyes wide open with surprise. Hercules stood still too, and stood staring at her with an expression of dismay. He no longer had the monk's costume on. "How did you get out here?" Migwan asked curiously. "You were inside, at the party." Hercules laughed nervously, and Migwan noticed that his jaw was trembling. "What's the matter, Hercules?" she asked. "What's happened?" "Now, missy," began Hercules, and Migwan could hear his teeth chatter, while his eyes began to roll strangely in his head. "What's the matter, are you sick?" asked Migwan in alarm. "Yes, that's it, chattered Hercules, finding his voice. "I'm awful sick. I had to come outside." "But I left you sitting in there a minute ago with your suit on," said Migwan wonderingly, "and you didn't come out after me. Did you go out of the front door?" "Yes, that's it," said Hercules hastily. "I come out the front door and round that way." A sudden impulse made Migwan look down the drive, covered with a light fall of snow and gleaming white in the glare of the street light. "But there aren't any footprints in the snow," she said in surprise. "Your footprints are coming from the barn?" A nameless uneasiness filled her. What was Hercules doing out here? "Yes," repeated Hercules vacuously, "L came from the barn." Migwan stared at him in surprise. Was he out of his mind? "Hercules," she began severely, but never finished the sentence, for the old man swayed, clutched at the empty air, and fell heavily in the snow at her feet. Chapter 14. An uninvited guest. Migwan ran into the house and burst breathlessly in upon the merrymakers. "Nyoda," she cried in a frightened voice, "Hercules is—" Then she stopped as though she had seen a ghost, for there sat Hercules in his monk's costume, just as he had been all evening. "What's the matter?" asked Nyoda in alarm, seeing her pale face and staring eyes. Migwan clutched her convulsively. "There's a man outside," she panted, "that looks just like Hercules, and when I spoke to him he fell down on the ground." In an instant all was pandemonium. Everybody NLSHED for the kitchen door and ran out into the yard, where the figure of a man lay dark upon the snow. Shenny tore off his mask and flung it away, and bending over the prostrate man turned his flashlight full on his face. "It is Hercules," he exclaimed in astonishment. "Is he dead?" faltered Migwan. "No, he's breathing, but he's unconscious," said Sherry. "It's his heart, I suppose. He's been having spells with it lately. Run into the house, somebody, and get that leather-covered flask in the medicine chest." Justice raced in for the flask and Sherry raised Hercules' head from the ground and poured some of the brandy between his lips. In a few minutes the old man began to stir and mutter, and Nyoda, holding his wrist, felt his pulse come up. They carried him to his room in the stable and laid him down on his bed, and Nyoda found the heart drops which Hercules had been taking for some time. "But where is the one I thought was Hercules, the one with the monk's suit on?" cried Migwan, after the first fright about Hercules had subsided. Sherry and the boys looked at one another dumbfounded. None of them had known, as Migwan did, that the brown robe and cowl presumably covered Hercules. They looked about for the brown figure that had moved so unobtrusively amongst them that evening. It had vanished. "He's gone," shouted Sherry excitedly. "There's something queer going on here." The monk was certainly not in the house any longer, and there were no footprints in the snow outside the house. "Did he fly away?" asked Sherry in perplexity. Justice jumped up with a great exclamation. "The secret passage," he shouted, "he's gone down the secret passage." They flew back inside the house to the stair landing, half expecting to find it standing open, but it was closed and looked perfectly natural. Sherry grasped the post, the landing slid out and the four went down the ladder. Justice gave a triumphant exclamation when he reached the bottom. "The barricades are taken down. He did come this way." They hurried through the door into the passage, half expecting to see a figure flying along ahead of them, but the passage was empty and no sound of a footfall broke the silence. They searched the place thoroughly, but nowhere did they find their man hidden. Behind the chest in the cave, however, Justice pounced upon something with a shout. It was the long brown costume that had been worn by the monk at the party. Chapter 15. Hercules' story. When Sherry and the boys returned from their filletless chase, Hercules had regained consciousness, and was telling Nyoda in a shaking voice that he felt better, but he was still too weak to sit up. "Ma time's come, Miss Lisbeth," he said mournfully. "LSE a goner." "Nonsense," said Nyoda brightly. "You'll be up and around in the morning. The doctor that gave you this medicine said you'd have these spells once in a while, but the heart drops would always bring you round all right." "LSEA going this time," he repeated. "Had a token. Dreamed about running water last night, and that's a sure sign." "Ain't no surer sign den that anywhere, Miss Lisbeth." "Nonsense," said Nyoda again. "You shouldn't believe in signs. Tell us what happened tonight and that'll make you feel better." "Miss Lisbeth," said the old man solemnly, "I going to tell the whole thing. I wasn't going to say nothing at all, but going to die, like I am, I scared to go and not tell you all." He took a sip from the tumbler at his hand and cleared his throat. "Miss Lisbeth," he began, "that weren't no burglar that git into the house that night. You just listen till I tell you the whole business. That day you all find dem footprints on the stairs. I mos had a fit, case I knowed somebody got into the second passage." "But you said you didn't know anything about a secret passage," said Nyoda, in surprise. "Miss Lisbeth," said Hercules deprecatingly, evidently urged on to open confession by the knowledge that death had him by the coat tail, "I said that, but it weren't TNLE. Ole Mas Jasper, he say once if I ever tell about that secret passage the debel d come in thu it and carry me off, and I been scared even to say secret passage." Dear weren't nobody living that knew about that secret passage, and when I sees dem footprints I reckons it muse be the devil himself. But yesterday I sees a man hangin' round behind a barn, and I ax him what he wants, and he sticks up 2 fingers and makes a sign that I uster know years ago. I looks at the man again, and I says, "For the Lord, the dead come to life." Case it's Mas Jasper's ole friend, Tad Phillips. A sharp exclamation of astonishment went around the circle of listeners. He's an ole man, and his hair's nearly white, but I see it were Mas Tad, all right. I hearn you all was dead, I says to him, but Mas Tad, he say no, people all thought he's dead and he let em think so, case he can't never meet up with his ole friends no more. You see, Miss Lisbeth, he threw in an explanation, Marsh Tad he gave some sick folks poison instead of medicine, and they die, and he go way, out in the country, and bimeby the papers say he's dead and his wife's dead. But they ain't, it's a mistake, but he don't tell nobody, and bimeby he come back, him and his wife. They take another name, and they goes to a town where nobody knows em. Bimeby a baby girl gets born and his wife she dies. Mas Tad he ain't never been himself since he gave dem folks that poison, he can't forget it at all. It pester him so he can't work, and he can't sleep, and he can't never laugh no more. He give up being a doctor case he say he can't trust himself no more. He gets so low in his mind when his wife die that he think he'll die too, and he sends the baby away to some folks that wants one. But he don't die, he just worry along, but he's powerful low in his mind all the time. He think all the time about dem people he poisoned. Finally he say he'll go away again, he'll go back to South America. But before he goes, he gets to thinking he'd like to see his Chile once. He finds out that the people he sent her to ain't never got her, that she's with somebody else, in a place called Millvale, in this very state. He go to Millvale, and he look in through the window, and he see her. She's the living image of his dead wife, light hair and dark eyes and all. He never let her know he's her father, case he feels so terrible bout dem folks he poisoned that he thinks he ain't no good, at all, and mustn't speak to her. But he's so wild to see her that he hang around in that town, working odd jobs, and at night looking in the window where she sits. Then suddenly the folks she's with up and move away, and he can't see her no more. He just can't stand it. He finds out that they come here to Oakwood, and he comes too. But he don't know which house she live in and he can't find her. He gets to wandering around, and one night he comes to the ole big house he used to live in, way up on Main Street Hill. It's all dark and tumble down, and he thinks he'll just go in once and look around. He goes in, and inside he hears a voice singing. It sounds just like his wife's voice. She were a beautiful singer, Miss Lisbeth, de Virginia Nightingale, folks used to call her. He stands there in that dark, empty house, listening to that voice, and he thinks it's his wife's spirit singing to him. She's singing a song she used to sing when she were young, something about larks. Katherine made a convulsive movement, and her heart began to pound strangely. Then he say a lady come in the front door and he gets scared and runs out. Katherine's head began to whirl, and she kept silence with an effort. He stand around outside for a while, and bimeby an automobile comes along and the folks carries a girl out of the house and takes her away. He sees the girl when day's blinging her out, and he knows she's his. He watches where that automobile goes and it comes here. The old man paused for a minute and looked around at the group at his bedside, all hanging spellbound upon his words. Miss Lisbeth, he said dramatically, little Missy Sylvia, Tad Phillips' little girl. When the sensation caused by his surprising story had subsided, Hercules continued, he just have to see her before he go away, and he remember about the secret passage through the hill that he and Mas Jasper used to play in. He come thu in the night and get into the house, but he can't find her. He see dears people sleeping in all the spare rooms that used to be empty, and he can't go looking round. He left dem footprints on the stairs, Miss Lisbeth, it ain't blood, it's paint. Days a ole jar of paint down dear in the passage, and he knocks it over and it breaks and he steps into the paint. But Hercules interrupted Sherry, how did he get into the passage from the outside? The way is blocked. Dear's another way to get out, replied Hercules, before you come to the door down dear. I just remember just how it is, but it comes up thu the floor of that little summer house down the hillside. The boys fixed it up after the other way was blocked. When I find Master Tad out behind the barn he's feeling sick, and I brought him in and put him in my bed. A light flashed through Nyosha's mind. Was that what you wanted the hot coffee for yesterday? She asked. Yeshon, replied Hercules meekly. Then he continued, Master Tad he want to see little missy so bad I promised her help him. When you all gives me that invite to the party and says I gotta wear a mask, I fixes it up with Master Tad to put on the masquerade suit after I get it and go in and see little missy. While he's inside I stays outside. Den all zero fa sudden out come Missy Camphor girl and sees me and screeches that she just left me inside. I got so scared I just nat chly collapsed. That's all. Your friend Tad ran out through the secret passage and disappeared, said Sherry. He's gone on the train by this time, said Hercules, his voice getting weak again. He was going on the 10:10. He's going to a sail in 00 years day. Phew, whistled Sherry. What a drama has been going on right under our very noses, and we're knowing nothing about it. Sylvia, the child of Uncle Jasper's old friend. And by what a narrow chance we came upon her. Into this excitement came Miguan, who had been in the house with Sylvia. Sylvia's sick, she said in a troubled voice to Nyoda. Her head is hot and her hands are like ice, and she's been coughing hard for the last half hour. She couldn't hold her head up for another minute, and I put her to bed. I was afraid she was going to be sick, said Nyoda. She'd been coughing off and on all day long, and her cheeks were so bright tonight, it seemed to me she looked feverish. I'm afraid the excitement of the party was too much for her. Don't anyone breathe a word of what Hercules has told us just now, she must be kept quiet. They all promised. In the moment when they stood looking at Hercules and waiting for Nyoda to start back to the house, Slim suddenly thought of something. If it wasn't he a thief that came in, why did he take your blanket? He asked. Hercules answered, addressing himself to Nyoda. Nless Tad didn't take that blanket, Miss Lisbeth. I took that blanket. But I didn't steal it. I just borrowed it. Borrowed it to wrap around Master Tad. I couldn't ask you all for one, case you all knew I had plenty, and I was scared you'd be gettin' suspicious. I saw you all putting that ole blanket away in that drawer a long time ago, and I thought you all never used it and would never know if it was gone for a day. It ain't hurt a mite, Miss Lisbeth. Dear, it is, over in the corner. How's you all know it was gone? He asked, in comical amazement. Nyoda explained, and soothed his agitation about the blanket in a few words. The strain of telling his story had worn him out and he lay back and began to gasp feebly. Everybody go back to the house, commanded Nyoda, and let Hercules rest. LSEA going this time, murmured the old man. LSE going to Abraham's bosom. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Nonsense, said Nyoda, you'll be all right in the morning, but she called Sherry back and asked him to stay with Hercules the rest of the night. Then she went back to the house and found Sylvia burning with fever and too hoarse to speak. She applied the usual remedies for a hard cold and rose from bed to see how she was every hour throughout the night. Morning brought no improvement, however, and with a worried look on her face Nyoda went downstairs and telephoned the doctor. Chapter 16. A letter. Sylvia's illness increased during the day, her fever rose rapidly and the coughing spells grew more violent and more frequent. Nyoda turned Hercules over to Sherry and Justice and gave Sylvia her whole attention. No whisper of the exciting news that rocked the family was allowed to come to her ears for fear of its effect upon the fever. Bronchitis, the doctor had said, whom Nyoda had hastily summoned. Watch out for pneumonia. The Winnebagos roamed the house, anxious and excited, talking in low tones about the amazing turn of events, and listening eagerly for Nyoda to come out of the sick room. Slim and the captain shifted uneasily from one chair to another until Katherine begged them to go out and take a long walk. "You make me nervous, trying so hard to keep quiet," she said to Slim. The boys went out. Migwan made some lemon jelly for Hercules and Sawa carried it out to him. "Does he still believe he's dying?" asked Katherine when Sawa returned to the house. "He's surer than ever," replied Sawa. "He's making the arrangements for his funeral. He's sorry now that he didn't join the Knights of Pythias when he had the chance, so he could have had a band." "Is he really as sick as that?" asked Himpaha in a scared voice. "Sherry says he isn't," said Sawa, "but Hercules insists that he won't live till morning. Sherry's getting sort of anxious about him himself," Justice told me outside the BAM. "Sherry said that Hercules believed so firmly in signs he'd just naturally worry himself to death before long, if he didn't stop thinking about the token he'd had. People do that sometimes. Hercules' health is bad and believing that his end was near might bring on a fatal spell." "Can't we do something to make him stop thinking about it?" asked Migwan. "Remember the Dark of the Moon Society, Sawa, that you got up to bring Katherine out of a fit of the blues that time up on Ellen's Isle?" "We can't do anything like that now, though," said Sawa. "The foolish things we do wouldn't have any effect upon him at all." "I guess you're right," said Migwan with a sigh, after various things had been suggested and immediately abandoned. "But I wish we could do something to rouse him from the dumps he's fallen into," she added with a sigh. "It seems as though we Winnebagos ought to be equal to the emergency." "You might read something to him," said Katherine desperately, after several minutes of hard thinking had sprouted no ideas. "Read him The Hound of the Baskervilles. That will gently divert his thoughts. It's absolutely the biggest thriller that was ever written. Judge Dalrymple bought it on the train once, when he was going from Milwaukee to some little town in Wisconsin, and he got so absorbed in it that he never came to until the train pulled into St. Paul, hundreds of miles beyond his stop. You might read him one chapter a day and he won't think of dying before he knows how it is coming out. It'll be a sort of Arabian Nights performance." "Where will I get the book?" asked Migwan. "Elle saw it in one of the cases in the library," replied Katherine. "It must have belonged to Mr. Carver's housekeeper, for I'm sure he never owned such a book." "All right," said Migwan, "let's take it out and tell Justice to read it to Hercules." Katherine found the book on the library shelf and opened it to a picture she wanted the girls to see. As she turned the pages, a letter fell out and dropped to the floor. She stopped to pick it up, and could not help reading the address. It was addressed to Mr. Jasper Carver, Esquire, and had never been opened. "Here's a letter for Uncle Jasper that must have come after he died," said Katherine, "for it hasn't been opened." Nyoda came into the room just then, and she handed it to her. Nyoda looked at the date. "The 12th of April, 1917, she read. "That's the very day Uncle Jasper died. This letter must have come while he lay dead in the house here, and in the confusion somebody put it into that book, where it has stayed all this while. I opened all the other letters that came after his death and took care of the matters they concerned. I hope this isn't a bill. The creditor will think we are poor business people not to reply." She reached for the letter opener and slit the envelope. Inside was a letter, not a bill, written in a cramped, shaky hand upon coarse note paper. It was dated from a small town in New York State. Nyoda carried it over to the window and read it. "Mr. Jasper Carver, Esquire, Oakwood, Pa. Dear Sir, I take the liberty of writing to you, for you are the only one I can find a trace of who was a friend of the late Dr. Sidney Phillips. I found a card with your name and address on the floor of his room after he left the army post at Fort Andrews, and to you I am committing the task of clearing his name from a disgrace which has unjustly been fastened upon it. He is dead, and the wrong can never be righted to him, but for the sake of his friends and relatives his memory must not remain dishonoured. This letter is at once an explanation and a confession. I was a captain of infantry at Fort Andrews when Dr. Phillips came there as army surgeon. There was another officer there, a sneaking, underhand sort of chap with whom I was having constant trouble. Upon one occasion he committed a grave breach of military discipline, but managed to throw the blame upon me, and I was deprived of my captain's commission and reduced to the ranks, besides doing time in the guard house. I brooded upon my wrong until I was ready to murder the man who had brought it upon me. At the time of the typhoid epidemic, matters were in bad shape at Fort Andrews. That was before the days of Red Cross nurses, and many of the boys had to turn in and nurse their comrades. I was detailed to help Dr. Phillips. The man who had ruined me was down with the fever. Ever since I had been reduced to the ranks he had taunted me openly with my disgrace, and even as he lay in bed he made insulting remarks when I brought him his medicine. Finally, in a mad rage, I decided to be revenged upon him once and forever. I put a deadly poison into the dose Dr. Phillips had just mixed for him, slipping it in while the doctor was out of the room for a moment. I thought the dose was intended for him alone, but to my horror it was given to a dozen men, and they all died. The whole country became stirred up about it, and such abuse was hurled at Dr. Phillips as no man ever suffered before. It was supposed that he had carelessly mistaken the poison for another harmless ingredient. I dared not confess that it was I who had done it, for in my case it would mean trial for first-degree murder, while with the doctor it was simply a case of accident, and would blow over in time. The doctor left the post, a broken-down, ruined man, and died of yellow fever in Cuba not long after. I have kept the secret for 25 years, suffering tortures of conscience, but not brave enough to confess. Now, however, I am in the last stages of a fatal disease and cannot live a week longer. By the time this reaches you I shall be gone. Take this confession and publish it to the world, that tardy justice may be done. The memo of Dr. Phillips. He was innocent of the whole thing. May God forgive me. GEORTU1E. The confession was witnessed by 2 doctors whose signatures appeared under his. He didn't do it. Tad didn't do it. The amazed cry rang through the library, as the Winnebagos and Nyoda clutched each other convulsively. We must bring him back, said Nyoda, and ran out to the barn to Shenny with the letter in her hand. An hour later Sherry and Hercules sat drinking strong, hot coffee at the kitchen table while Nyoda hastily packed travelling bags for them. Hercules had forgotten all about dying. When he heard the news in the letter he sprang from bed and began dressing with greater speed than he had ever done in his life. The train for New York went in 2 hours and he and Sherry must catch it if they hoped to reach the steamer before she sailed. There was no way of reaching Tad by telegraph. They did not know what name he was going under, nor the name of the boat on which he was to sail. The only thing they could do was rush to New York, find out which boat was sailing for South America on the first, go on board and search for Tad. Only Hercules would be able to identify him. Hercules rose to the occasion. We certainly gave Hercules something to make him forget his superstition, said Katherine, sitting down on the sink to collect her thoughts after the meteoric flight of the 2 men from the house. We certainly did, said Miguan, trembling with excitement. A racking cough sounded through the house. Sure, Sylvia's worse, said Miguan, putting her fingers to her lips. Don't anybody go near her, or she'll notice how excited you are. How on earth does Nyoda manage to keep so calm when she's with her? If Sylvia should get pneumonia, began Sawa, and then chocked over the dreadful possibility. If they only bring Mr. Phillips back in time, said Katherine, as if echoing the thing that lay in Sawa's thoughts. "Don't say such dreadful things," said Himpaha, with starting tears. "Maybe they won't be able to find him at all," said Katherine dubiously. They must," said Sawa, with dry lips. "They must," echoed the others, and hardly daring to think, they entered upon the trying period of waiting. Chapter 17. Waiting. "How is Sylvia?" Katherine's voice was husky with anxiety. Nyoda looked grave over the tray she was carrying down to the kitchen. "No better yet, a little worse this morning, if anything. Her fever has gone up 1 degree during the night and she is coughing more than ever." "Is it going to be pneumonia?" asked Katherine steadily, her eyes searching Nyoda's face. "Not if I can help it," replied Nyoda, in a tone of grim determination, the light of battle sparkling in her eyes. Nevertheless, there was a note of worry in her voice that stnlck cold fear into Katherine's heart, stoutly optimistic as she was. What if Sylvia should die before her father came back? The other Winnebagos, clustering around Nyoda to hear the latest news from Sylvia's bedside, stood hushed and solemn. Nyoda set the tray down on the table and leaned wearily against the door, her eyes heavy from lack of sleep. Instantly Migwan was at her side, all solicitude. "Go, lie down and sleep a while," Nyoda she urged. "You've been up nearly all night. I can look after Sylvia for a few hours, I know how. Go to bed now and we'll bring some breakfast up to you, and then you can go to sleep." Putting her arm around Nyoda she led her upstairs and tucked her into bed, smoothing the covers over her with gentle, motherly hands, while the girls below prepared a dainty breakfast tray. "Nice, child," murmured Nyoda, from the depths of her pillow. "Nice old Migwan. Always taking care of someone." Her voice trailed off in a tired whisper, and by the time the breakfast tray arrived she was sound asleep. Sylvia also slept most of the time that Migwan watched beside her, a fitful slumber broken by many coughing spells and intervals of difficult breathing. Never had Sylvia seemed so beautiful and so princess-like to Migwan as when she lay there sleeping in the big four-poster bed, her shining curls spread out on the pillow and her fever-flushed cheeks glowing like roses. Lying there so still, with her delicate little white hand resting on top of the coverlet, she brought to Migwan's mind Gertie's description of the beautiful, dead mignon, in whom the vivid tints of life had been counterfeit by skillful hands. To Migwan's lively imagination it seemed that Sylvia was another mignon, this child of lofty birth and breeding also cast by accident among humble surroundings, and singing her way into the hearts of people. Would it be with her as it had been with Mignon? Would she never be reunited in life with her own people? The resemblance between the two lives stnlck Migwan as a prophecy, and her heart chilled with the conviction that Sylvia was going to die. Tears stole down her cheek as she saw, in her mind's eye, the father coming in just too late, and their beautiful, radiant Sylvia lying cold and still, her joyful song forever hushed. Migwan's melancholy mood lasted all morning, even after Nyoda came back and sent her out of the sick room, and she sat staring into the library fire in gloomy silence, quite unlike her busy, cheery self. The day crept by on leaden feet. The hands of the clock seemed to be suffering from paralysis, they stayed so long in one spot. Ordinarily clock hands at Carver House went whirling around their dials like pinwheels, and the chimes were continually striking the hour. Now each separate minute seemed to have brought its knitting and come to stay. "No word from Sherry and Hercules yet," sighed Sawa impatiently, as the whistles blew 11:30. "Give them a chance," said Katherine, her voice proceeding in muffled tones from the depths of the music cabinet, which, in order to pass away the time, she had undertaken to set to rights. "They've had plenty of chance by this time to get down on board the boat," returned Sawa, getting up from her chair and pacing restlessly up and down the room. Sawa was not equipped by nature to bear suspense calmly. Under the stress of inaction she threatened to fly to pieces. Katherine looked up with a faint smile from the heaps of sheet music lying on the floor around her. "Come and help me sort this music," she advised mildly. "It'll settle your mind somewhat, besides giving me a lift. I'm afraid I've bitten off more than I can chew. This is one grand mess of pieces without covers and covers without pieces. You might get all the covers in order for me." Sylvia gazed without enthusiasm upon the littered floor. "Sort music, ah," she said, with a grimace and a disgusted shnlg of her shoulders. She picked her way to the other end of the library and stood staring restlessly out of the window. It was a dreary, dull day. The Christmas snow had vanished in a thaw, and a chilly rain beat against the window panes with a dismal, melancholy sound. The three boys fidgeted from one end of the house to the other, but could not get up enough steam to go out for a hike. Slim and the captain drummed chopsticks on the piano, and Justice tried to keep up with them on the harp, until Migwan ordered them to be quiet so Sylvia could sleep, after which they sat in preternatural silence before the library fire, listlessly thumbing over the pages of magazines which they did not even pretend to read. The atmosphere of the house got so on everybody's nerves that the snapping of a log in the fireplace almost caused a panic. The clock struck 12, and Migwan, rousing herself from her preoccupation, went out into the kitchen to prepare lunch, aided by Gladys and Himpaha, while Sylvia continued to pace the floor and Katherine went on nervously fitting covers to pieces and pieces to covers, her ear ever on the alert for the sound of the telephone bell. Justice and Slim and the captain, grown weary of their own company, trooped out into the kitchen after the girls, declaring they were going to get lunch, and it was not long before the inevitable reaction had set in, and pent-up spirits began to find vent in irrepressible hilarity. Protests were useless. In vain Migwan flourished her big iron spoon and ordered them out. Justice calmly took her apron and cap away from her and announced that he was going to be chief cook. Tying the apron around him wrong side out, and setting the cap backward on his head, he held the spoon aloft like a Roman short sword, and striking an attitude in imitation of Spartacus addressing the gladiators, he declaimed feelingly, "Ye call me chef, and ye do well to call him chef who for 7 long years has camped in summertime, and made his coffee out of rain when there was no spring turra handy, and mixed his biscuits in the wash basin, because the baking pan no longer was. But I was not always thus, an unhired butcher, a savage chef of still more savage menus." The tea kettle suddenly boiled over with a loud hissing and sizzling, and the impassioned orator jumped as though he had been shot, then, collecting himself, he nlshed over and picked the kettle from the stove and stood holding it in his hand, unsnine what to do with it. "Set it down on the back of the stove," commanded Migwan. "A great cook you are. Even Slim would know enough to do that." "Thanks for the implied compliment," said Slim stiffly. "Slim ought to be chief cook," said the captain. "He's fat. Chief cooks are always fat." "Right you are," cried Justice, taking off the apron and tying it around Slim as far as it would go. "But I can't cook," protested Slim. "That doesn't make any difference," replied Justice. "You look the part, and that's all that's needed. Looks are everything, these days." He perched the cap rakishly on top of Slim's head and stood off a little distance to eye the effect critically. "Nobody could tell the difference between you and the chef of the Waldorf," was his verdict. Indeed, Slim, with his full moon face shining out under the cap, and the apron tied around his extensive waistline, looked just like the pictured cooks in the spaghetti advertisements. "Isn't he the perfect chef, though?" continued Justice admiringly. "He must have been born with an iron spoon in his hand, instead of a gold one in his mouth." Then, turning to Slim and bowing low before him, he chanted solemnly, go forth, Lars Porsena, go forth, beloved of heaven. All the other cooks will drown themselves in their soup kettles in despair when they see you coming. All hail the chief cook." "But I can't cook," repeated Slim helplessly. "You don't have to," Justice reassured him. "Chief cooks don't have to cook, they just direct the others. Behold, we stand ready to obey your lightest command." "All right," said Slim, "suppose you pare the potatoes." Ask me anything but that. Justice begged him. I'll never get the eyes cut out, and then when they are on my plate they look up at me reproachfully, like this. Justice screwed up his face and rolled his eyes into a grimace that convulsed the girls. No, you pare the potatoes, Slim, he continued. The chief cook always pares the potatoes himself. It's too delicate a job to entrust to a subordinate. Slim had his mouth open to protest, and Sawa and Katherine, who had just wandered out into the kitchen, were in a gale of merriment over Slim's costume, when the doorbell rang and a messenger boy passed in a telegram. They all pressed around eagerly while Katherine read it. It was from Sherry. South America boat sailed yesterday. Dr. Phillips gone. Can get no clue. Coming home tonight. A long, tragic OHH from Himpaha broke the stricken silence which had fallen on the group at the reading of the message. Tough luck, said the captain feelingly, and Justice repeated, tough luck, like an echo. The Winnebagos glanced uncertainly toward the stairway and looked at each other inquiringly. Somebody go up and call Nyoda, said Katherine. Just at that moment the door of Sylvia's room opened and Nyoda came tunning downstairs with light, swift footsteps, her face wreathed in smiles. Sylvia's better, she called, before she was halfway down. The fever left her while she was sleeping, and her temperature is normal. The danger of pneumonia is over. I'm so relieved. She skipped down the last of the stairs like a young girl. Then she caught sight of the telegram in Katherine's hand, and sensed the atmosphere of depression that prevailed in the lower hall. She knew the truth before a word was spoken, and composed herself to meet it. They were too late, she said quietly, as she joined the group, and held out her hand for the bit of yellow paper. Poor Sylvia, she exclaimed huskily. She would soon be well enough to hear the news, and now there is nothing to tell her. If we had only found that letter a day sooner. Chapter 18. Katherine goes to the city. Does anyone want to go into the city this afternoon? Asked Nyoda, as they rose from luncheon. It had been a rather silent, dispirited meal, and quickly gotten over with. I had planned to go in and take a few things to Mrs. Dean today, but now it will be impossible for me to get away. Sylvia has been fretting about her aunt and I think someone ought to go. I'll go, said Katherine readily, her spirits rising at this prospect of action. The suspense of morning, ending in such a disappointment, had begun to react upon her in a fit of the blues. Sawa and Himpaha, with Slim and the captain, had planned during luncheon to go roller skating that afternoon, but as Katherine could not roller skate, the plan held no attraction for her. Justice had promised Sherry that he would go over the lighting system on his car while he was away and was planning to spend the whole afternoon in the garage. McWan was going to sit with Sylvia to give Nyoda a chance to rest, and Gladys had a sore throat which made her disinclined to talk. Taking it by and large, Katherine had anticipated a rather dismal afternoon, a prospect which was pleasantly altered by Nyoda's request. You can make the 2 o'clock train if you stand immediately, continued Nyoda, and the 5:15 will bring you back in time for dinner. I have the things for Mrs. Dean already. Katherine rose with alacrity and put on her hat and coat. Any errands while I am in town? She asked, hunting for her umbrella in the stair closet. None that I can think of, replied Nyoda, after wrinkling her brow for a moment, unless you want to stop at the jeweller's and get my watch. It's been there for several weeks, being regulated. All right, said Katherine, writing down the name of the jeweller in her memorandum book. You'll notice I'm not listing my memoir this time, she remarked laughingly. I'll take the 5:15 train back, she called over her shoulder as she went out of the front door. Be careful how you hold that package, Nyoda called warningly after her. There's a glass of jelly in it that'll upset. Gingerly holding the package by the string, Katherine picked her way through the rapidly widening puddles on the sidewalks to the station. By some miracle of good luck the package was still right side up when she arrived at the hospital, and she breathed an audible sigh of relief when it was at last safely out of her hands. She found Mrs. Dean a frail, kindly-faced woman, bearing her discomfort cheerfully, but, nevertheless, lonesome in this strange hospital ward and very grateful for any attention shown her. Katherine began, as she described it, to express her sympathy quietly and in a ladylike manner, and ended up by delivering her famous women's rights speech for the benefit of the whole ward. She finally escaped, after her sixth encore, and fetched up breathless on the sidewalk, only to discover that she had left her umbrella behind, and before she retrieved it she had to give her speech all over again, for the benefit of an old lady who had been asleep during the first performance. There still being 3/4 of an hour before train time after she had called at the jeweller's for Nyoda's watch, Katherine dropped into a smart little tea room to while away the intervening moments, with a cup of tea and a dish of her favourite shrimp salad. As she nibbled leisurely at a dainty round of brown bread and idly watched the throngs coming and going at the tables around her, a shriek of delight suddenly rang out above the hum of voices and the clatter of dishes. "Katherine! Katherine Adams!" Katherine looked up to see an animated little figure in a beaver coat and fur hat coming toward her through the crowd. "Katherine Adams," repeated the voice, "don't you know me?" "Why, Veronica." "Veronica Leha," gasped Katherine in amazement. "What are you doing here? I thought you were in New York." She caught the little brown-gloved hands in her own big ones and squeezed them until Veronica winced. "Katherine? Dear old Kay! How I've missed you!" Veronica cried rapturously, and drawing her hands from Katherine's grip she flung her arms impulsively around her neck, regardless of the curious stares of the onlookers. "Let them stare," she murmured stoutly, seeing Katherine's face flush with embarrassment as she encountered the quizzical gaze of a keen-eyed young man at the next table. If they hadn't seen their beloved Kay for nearly 2 years they'd want to hug her, too. She released Katherine after a final squeeze, and stood staring at her with a puzzled expression on her vivacious face. "What's the matter?" asked Katherine wonderingly. "Have I got something on wrong side before?" "That's just what is the matter," replied Veronica, her bewilderment also manifesting itself in her tone. "You haven't anything on wrong side before. You don't look natural. What has happened to you?" "Nothing," replied Katherine, laughing, "and everything. I've just learned that clothes do matter, after all." "Why, Katherine Adams, you're perfectly stunning," exclaimed Veronica in sincere admiration. "That shade of blue in your dress, it was simply made for you." "Elle just happened to get it by accident," said Katherine deprecatingly, almost sheepishly, yet thrilled through and through with pleasure at Veronica's words of appreciation. It was no small triumph to be admired by Veronica, whose highly artistic nature made her extremely critical of people's appearance. "How I used to make your anistic eye water," said Katherine laughingly. "It's a wonder you stood me as well as you did." "It was not I who had to stand you, but you who had to stand me," said Veronica seriously. "In spite of your loose ends you were, what do you call it, all wool and a yard wide, but I was the original PNME." Veronica, while a perfect master of literary English, still faltered deliciously over slang phrases. Katherine, as usual, steered away from the subject of Veronica's former attitude toward her. When a thing was over and done with, Katherine argued, there was no use of dragging it out into the light again. "You haven't told me yet how you happen to be here in this tea room this afternoon," she said, by way of changing the subject, "when you told us, over your own signature, that you would have to stay in New York all this week." "What do you mean?" she finished with mock gravity, "by deceiving us so?" "I'll have to play at a concert here in town tonight," explained Veronica. "It will be necessary for me to be back at the conservatory tomorrow, and am returning by a late train tonight. I didn't know about it when I wrote to Nyoda, or I should have insisted on her coming in for the concert and bringing all the girls along. It's an emergency case, I'm just filling in on the program in place of a cello soloist who was taken suddenly ill with influenza." The concert manager sent a hurry call to Martini last night, asking him to send over the first student who happened to be handy, and as I happened to be taking a lesson from Manini at the time, I was the lucky one. I just came over this afternoon. Veronica modestly suppressed the fact that it had been the great Manini himself who had been urgently requested to play at the concert, but having a previous engagement, had chosen her, out of the whole conservatory, to play in his stead. "NDY aunt is here with me," continued Veronica. "She's over at that table in the far corner behind that palm. I suppose she is wondering what has become of me by this time. When I saw you over here I just jumped up and ran off without a word of explanation. She's probably eaten up my nut rolls by this time, too. They were just being served when I rushed away. Come on over and see her." Katherine followed Veronica through the crowded room to the far corner, where, at a little table beneath a softly shaded wall lamp, Veronica's aunt, Mrs. Lahar, sat placidly sipping tea and eating cakes. She did not recognize Katherine at first, never having seen her otherwise than with clothes awry and hair tumbling down over her eyes, and Katherine was secretly amused at the gentle lady's look of astonishment upon being told who it was. "She did eat my rolls, after all," said Veronica to Katherine. "Elle knew she would. But I'm glad she did. I am in far too exalted a mood for nut rolls now. Nothing but nectar and ambrosia will do to celebrate our meeting. Look and see if there's any nectar and ambrosia on your menu card, will you, Katherine dear? There doesn't seem to be any on mine." "None here," either, reported Katherine, after gravely reading her card through. "Then let's compromise on lobster croquettes," said Veronica. "I never eat them ordinarily, but I feel as though I could eat a dozen to celebrate this occasion." "Be careful what you eat," now warned her aunt. "It would be rather awkward if I were to be taken with an attack of acute indigestion just when you are due to appear on the platform." "Never fear," laughed Veronica. "I am so transported over meeting Katherine that nothing could give me indigestion now. What an inspiration I shall have to play tonight." Then, taking Katherine's hand, she said coaxingly, "You will come and hear me play, won't you?" "I'm afraid I can't," replied Katherine regretfully. "I'm due to go back on the 5:15 train." "Oh, but you must come," cried Veronica pleadingly. "I'll be so miserable if I don't that I shan't be able to play at all. You wouldn't want me to spoil the concert on your account, would you, Katherine dear? There is a later train you can go home on just as well, isn't there?" "There is one at 10:45, replied Katherine, consulting the timetable which she carried in her handbag. "You can hear me play, and make that train, too," said Veronica eagerly. "My numbers come in the early part of the program, all but one. If you went out after I had played my first group you could make your train beautifully. Do telephone Nyoda that you are going to stay over, and have her send somebody down to meet you at the later train." "That justice person," she said mischievously, finishing with an expressive movement of her eyebrows. Katherine finally yielded to her pleading, and telephoned Nyoda that she was going to stay in town until the 10:45, which so delighted Veronica that she ordered another croquette all the way around to celebrate the happy circumstance. "Do be careful, dear," warned her aunt a second time. "Those croquettes are distressingly rich. What would happen if you were to be taken ill tonight?" Veronica smiled serenely. "I'm not going to be taken ill tonight, auntie dear," she replied. "I'm going to be like Katherine, who can eat phony lobster croquettes without getting sick. Remember the mixtures we used to cook up in the house of the open door?" she asked, turning to Katherine. "They were lots worse than lobster croquettes, if the plain TNLTH were known. You wouldn't worry at all, auntie, dear, if you knew what we used to eat at those spreads without damaging ourselves." Katherine was completely carried away by Veronica's vivaciousness and temperamental whimsies. If she had admired the fiery little Hungarian in the days of the House of the Open Door, she was now absolutely enslaved by her. Toplin, matter-of-fact Katherine, Veronica, with her artistic temperament, was a creature from another world, inspiring a certain amount of awed wonder, as well as admiring affection. "What are you going to play at the concert tonight?" Katherine asked respectfully. Veronica's eyes began to glow, and she pushed aside her plate, leaving the second croquet to grow cold while she spoke animatedly upon the subject that lay ever nearest her hilt. "I'm going to play a cycle from Nyoda, a Romanian gypsy composer," she replied. "One of the pieces is the most wonderful thing. It's called The Whirlwind. It fairly carries you away with its rush and movement, until you want to fly, and shout, and go sailing away on the wings of the wind. Another one is named Fata Morgana. You know, that's what people call the mirage that we can see out on the steppes, the open plains, of Hungary." "Yes," murmured Katherine in a tone of eager interest. She loved to hear Veronica tell tales of her homeland. "Many a time I have seen it," continued Veronica, her eyes sparkling with a dreamy, far-off light, "a beautiful city standing out clear and fair against the horizon, and have gone forth to find it, only to see it vanish into the hot, quivering air, and to find myself lost out on the wide, lonely steppe." Katherine listened, fascinated, while Veronica told stories of the curious mirage that lured and mocked the dwellers on the lonely steppes of her native land, and so deep was her absorption that she absent-mindedly ate up Veronica's croquet while she listened, to the infinite amusement of Mrs. Leha. "Aren't you going to play any of your own compositions?" asked Katherine, when Veronica had finished talking about the Nyoda cycle. "Not as a regular number," replied Veronica, taking up her fork to finish her croquet, and deciding that she must already have eaten it, since her plate was empty. "If, by any chance, I should be encored, I shall play a little piece of my own that I have named Fire Dreams and dedicated to the Winnebagos. I wrote it one night after a ceremonial meeting out in the woods where we danced around the fire and then sat down in a circle to watch it bum itself away to embers. We all told our dreams for the future that night, don't you remember? I have woven everything together in my piece, the tall pines towering up to the sky, the stars peering through the branches, the wind fiddling through the leaves, and the river lapping on the stones below, with the firelight waving and flickering, and coaxing us to tell our dreams. I love to play it, because it brings back that scene so vividly, that and all the other beautiful times we had around the campfire." Katherine gazed at Veronica in speechless admiration. With absolutely no musical ability herself, it seemed to her that anyone who could compose music was a child of the gods. Veronica smiled back frankly into Katherine's admiring eyes, and gave her hand a fond squeeze. "Now, tell me about Carver House and all the dear people there," she said, settling herself comfortably in her chair and propping her elbows on the table. "We still have an hour to spare. Auntie won't mind if we talk about our own affairs, will you, Auntie? Now, Katherine, take a long breath and begin." The hour was up before Katherine was halfway through telling the exciting things that had happened at Carver House in the past week, and with a sigh Veronica rose from the table and drew on her gloves. "Come," she said regretfully, "we'll have to be starting. I have to go over to the hotel first and get my violin, and the auditorium where I am to play is some distance out." As they stepped from the tea room into the street, Katherine paused to buy Veronica a huge bunch of violets at a little stand just inside the entrance of the tall building next door. Not having enough money in her change purse to pay for them, she took a roll of bills from a billfold in her inner pocket, and, taking $5 from the roll, returned it to its place of safety in the lining of her coat. Lounging against the glass counter beside her was a slender, long-fingered man, whose gaze suddenly became concentrated when the roll of bills made its appearance. Katherine noticed his look of absorbed interest, and a little thrill of uneasiness prickled along her spine. She looked sharply at this inquisitive stranger, fixing in her mind the details of his appearance. He wore a long, light-colored overcoat and a visor cap pulled down over his eyes, which were small and dark, and set close together in his thin, sallow face, giving him a peculiar, rat-like expression. Katherine buttoned her coat carefully over the billfold and hastily rejoined Veronica and Mrs. Lehar in the street outside, conscious that the man's eyes were still upon her and that he had followed her out of the shop. To her relief, Mrs. Lehar hailed a taxicab, and in a moment more they were being whirled rapidly away from the scene. An hour later Katherine found herself sitting in state in one of the front boxes of a crowded auditorium, impatiently waiting for the soprano soloist to finish a lengthy operatic aria and yield her place to Veronica. The soloist bowed her way out at last, and Veronica, looking like a very slender little child in contrast to the massive singer, tripped out on the stage with her violin under her arm, just as she had always carried it around in the house of the open door. "She isn't a bit scared," was Katherine's admiring thought. Nodding brightly to the audience, Veronica laid her bow across the strings with that odd little caressing gesture that Katherine remembered so well, and began to play her long cycle from memory. Strange images flitted through Katherine's brain as she listened. The lighted stage faded from sight, and in its place there stretched a wide, grassy plain, shimmering in the sunlight and flecked with racing cloud shadows. Far ahead, gleaming clear against the grey-blue horizon, rose the white towers and spires of a fair city, which seemed to call to her in friendly invitation, awakening in her an irresistible longing to travel toward it and behold its wonders at near hand. But ever as she approached it receded into the distance, vanishing at last in the twinkling of an eye, and leaving her alone in the hilltop of a wild, desolate moor upon which darkness was swiftly falling. She started in affright at the long, eerie cry of a night bird. The deepening shadows were filled with fearful, unnamable terrors. Her head reeled, the strength went out from her limbs, and with icy hands pressed tightly over her eyes to shut out the menacing shadow shapes, she sank shuddering to the ground. She was roused by the sound of thunder, and opening her eyes found the lonely moor vanished, and in its place the brightly lighted stage, while the thunder which echoed in her ears resolved itself into a tumult of hand-clapping. Katherine nibbed her eyes and sat up straight. "What was that piece she just played?" she asked in a whisper. "That was the Fata Morgana," replied Mrs. Lehar. It was several minutes after 10 o'clock when Veronica finished her last encore, and Katherine, glancing at her watch, hastily reached for her coat, and leaving a good-night message for Veronica with Mrs. Lehar, started from the auditorium. Chapter 19. The Further Adventures of Katherine. The curious spell of the Fata Morgana descended upon Katherine again as she emerged from the concert hall and made her way through a poorly lighted side street toward the main avenue where the street cars passed. The long, waving shadows seemed to clutch at her ankles as she walked. Strange noises sounded in her ears. The trees that bordered the curb left their places and began to move toward her with a grotesque, circling motion, while the distant glare of light toward which she was traveling began to recede until it was a mere twinkling speck, miles away in the distance. Again her strength forsook her, and with violently trembling hands she grasped an iron fence railing and clung desperately to keep herself from falling. The touch of the cold metal sent a little shock tingling through her. She braced herself and looked steadily at the spectres crowding about her. The trees had gone back into their places. The shadows no longer seemed to be crouching ready to spring at her. "Silly!" exclaimed Katherine, though her teeth still chattered. She let go of the fence and started on. Immediately the trees resumed their fantastic circling, and again her knees threatened to double under her. Then she realized that it was not the Fata Morgana that held her in thrall, but the extra lobster croquette. The disastrous fate which Mrs. Lehar had predicted would overtake Veronica had befallen her instead. She was in the throes of acute indigestion. Oh, if only she had not eaten that second croquette! Lobster never agreed with her. She should have known better than to eat it, especially after she had just eaten shrimp salad. Why hadn't she had the sense to refuse that second one? Katherine was still unaware that she had eaten, not 2, but 3 of the deadly things, a circumstance which had undoubtedly saved Veronica from a like fate. She clung dizzily to the fence for a few moments, and then, feeling somewhat relieved by the cold wind blowing strongly against her face, struck out once more for the car line. A few steps convinced her that she could not make it. The world was whirling around her, and her limbs refused to obey her will. A little farther up the street, where the fence ended, the arched entranceway into a church offered a resting place and shelter against the high wind and beating rain. Stumbling up the steps, she sank down on the stone floor, and, pressing her cold hand against her throbbing temples, leaned weakly against the wall of her little sanctuary. Weariness overcame her and she sank gradually into a doze, from which she wakened with a start at the sound of a steeple clock chiming. Boom! 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 The clanging tones echoed through the narrow street. Katherine sat up hastily and stared around her in bewilderment for a moment, then recollected herself and rose cautiously to her feet. To her infinite relief she found that her knees no longer had any inclination to knock together. The feeling of illness had passed. Taking a deep breath, and setting her hat straight on her head, she walked steadily down the steps and out upon the street once more. The clock which had wakened her so rudely was in the steeple just above her, and Katherine gave a gasp of dismay when she saw the time. 11:15. She should be down at the station now, taking the 10:45 train back to Oakwood. What had happened? Could she possibly have fallen asleep in that cozy little entranceway? Why had she not heard the clock strike the half-hour? How worried Nyoda would be when she did not come in on that 10:45 train. She thought in sudden panic. She must hasten down to the station immediately and telephone Nyoda that she had missed the train, but would come on the next. Was there another train tonight? She wondered, in fresh panic. 10:45 sounded like the last local. She stopped under a street light for the purpose of consulting her timetable, and then she made a discovery which drove the matter of timetables out of her head entirely, and brought the weakness back to her knees in full force, namely, the discovery that she no longer carried her handbag. Her heart almost stopped beating, for in that handbag was Nyoda's watch, the little jeweled watch she had given her for an engagement present. Aside from its intrinsic value, which was considerable, Nyoda cherished that watch above all her other possessions. She must have left the bag in the entranceway where she had stopped to rest, Katherine decided, and, forgetting all about the weakness of a half-hour ago, she ran swiftly across the street and up the steps of the church. She felt over every inch of the floor in the darkness, but the bag was not there. Had she brought it with her out of the auditorium? Yes, because she had dropped it in the lobby, and in stooping to pick it up had felt the first touch of that dizziness which had overpowered her so soon afterward. She must have lost it in the street. She retraced her steps back to the concert hall, now dark and deserted, carefully searching all the way. Her search, however, was unavailing, and with a sinking feeling she realized that either someone had picked it up, or else she had been deliberately robbed while she slept. In either event, the bag was gone, and with it Nyoda's watch. It seemed to her that she could never go home and tell Nyoda that it was lost. She wished the earth would open up and swallow her where she stood, thus releasing her, at one stroke, from her distressful position. She bitterly reproached herself for having stayed in town. That she had gone home on the 5:15 train, this wouldn't have happened. Nyoda had given her precious watch into her keeping, trusting her to bring it back safely, and she had betrayed that trust, had proved herself unreliable. Nyoda would never trust her with anything valuable again, would never send her on another errand. True, it was not exactly her fault that she had lost the bag, but if she had not been foolish enough to eat all those lobster croquettes after eating shrimp salad, she would not have had any dizzy spell to distract her attention from her responsibility. For fully 5 minutes she stood still and called herself even hard name she could think of, and ended up by making an emphatic resolution in regard to the future attitude toward lobster croquettes. In the meantime, she decided, she had better notify the police about the watch. A block ahead of her the green and blue lights of a drug-store shone blurred but unmistakable through the misty atmosphere, and she splashed her way toward it, only to find on arriving that the place was closed. She walked several more blocks, searching either for an open dillig store where she could telephone, or come a policeman, and finding neither. A street clock pointed to 11, and from somewhere in the darkness behind her came the subdued tone of the steeple chime. The rain had stopped now, and it was growing colder. The puddles on the sidewalk began to be filmed over with ice. The wind took on a cutting edge and came sallying forth in great gusts, shrieking along the telephone wires and setting the electric arc lights overhead swaying wildly back and forth, until the rapidly shifting lights and shadows below gave the street the look of a tossing lake. Now billowing out like a sail, now wrapping itself determinedly around her ankles, Katherine's long coat began to make walking a difficult proceeding. Then, without waning, the arc lights suddenly went out, plunging the world into utter blackness. With that, Katherine abandoned her intention of searching for a telephone and decided to get down to her train as fast as she could. With every other step she went crashing through a thin coating of ice into a puddle, for in the darkness it was impossible to see where she was going, and once she tripped over an uneven edge of flagging and went sprawling on her hands and knees. Thereafter, she felt her way, like a blind person, with the point of her umbrella. It was gradually borne in upon Katherine, as she floundered on through the puddles, that she was not retracing her steps toward the car line, but was proceeding in a new and entirely unknown direction. The store fronts which loomed indistinctly through the darkness were not the same ones she had passed before. Surely those others had not been so shabby and disreputable looking. But so intense was the blackness of the night that she could not be sure about anything. She might be on the right track after all. Undoubtedly the next turn would bring her back to the lighted DMG store, and from that point she could easily locate herself. No green and blue lights appeared when she turned the next comer. However, as far as she could see, there was only gloom in the distance. Katherine tried street after street with no better success. They all led endlessly on into darkness. She met no one from whom she dared ask the way, for there was only an occasional passer-by, and he usually looked tipsy. It was evidently a factory district Katherine had wandered into, for all around her were great dark buildings with high chimneys, long, dim warehouses, box cars standing on sidings, silent, gloomy freight sheds. There seemed to be no end of them anywhere. In all directions they stretched out, like Banquo's descendants, apparently to the crack of doom. The nightmare of the Fata Morgana had come true, and she was lost in the wilderness of a strange city. For a long time Katherine had not heard the rumble of a street car, and this phenomenon finally became so noticeable that she realized what must have happened. The traction power had been cut off as well as the lighting current. With that realization her last hope of getting down to the station went glimmering, unless she could get a taxicab. But where was one to find a taxicab in this district? A faint light gleaming in the window of a small shop that crouched between two tall factories lured Katherine on with the hope that here was a telephone, or at least someone about who could tell her the way. She hastened toward it, but her heart turned to water within her when she saw that the lettering on the window pane was Chinese. More than anything else in the whole universe, Katherine feared a Chinaman. She was so afraid of the little yellow men that even in broad daylight she could never go by a Chinese laundry without holding her breath and shuddering. Even the picture of a Chinaman gave her the creeps. When she discovered that she was in a Chinese neighborhood after 11 o'clock at night, with the street lamps all out, a hoarse cry of terror broke involuntarily from her lips, and she began to NM blindly, she knew not where, penetrating deeper and deeper into that jungle of factories which flanks the railroad on both sides for miles. Out of breath finally, she came to a stop, and for a few moments stood gasping, with a hand to her side. Not far ahead of her a light from a building shone across the darkness of the street, and loud sounds of revelry coming from the direction of the light told her that the place was a saloon. She stood still for another moment, trying to get up courage to pass it, decided at last that with Chinamen in the other direction it was the lesser of two evils, and walked on, praying fervently that none of the revelers inside would come out at the moment she was going by. She had hardly gone a few steps when a figure appeared on the lighted sidewalk in front of the place with a suddenness which left no doubt of his having come from within. In the bright glare, Katherine recognized the long light coat and visor cap of the man who had stood beside her that evening in the flower shop where she had purchased Veronica's violets, and who had looked with such a covetous eye upon the roll of bills she had taken from her inside coat pocket. The bills were still there, and it seemed to her now that they made a very telltale bulge over her right breast. The man was coming toward her. In a few minutes he would see and recognize her, and then Katherine darted into an alleyway which opened near her, and on through a half-open gate in a low, solid wooden fence, and crouching there behind the fence in the darkness, she waited until the footsteps had gone past, creak, creak, creakety creak, with a rhythmic squeaking of shoes. Not until the sound had died away completely did she venture forth from her hiding place, and then she stood perfectly still and looked cautiously about her in every direction before she made a move to proceed. With the knowledge that the danger had passed, her feeling of panic began to leave her, and her native coolness began to assert itself. She took a careful stock of her situation and tried to think up a way to escape from her predicament. That she was hopelessly lost in this wilderness of streets whose names meant nothing to her, even if she had been able to see the signboards, she realized full well. Instinct warned her not to betray her situation to anyone she might meet in this neighborhood, providing she met anyone, for the wind seemed to have blown all pedestrians off the streets, and the lateness of the hour made it extremely improbable that she would find a telephone. She stood on one leg in the stork-like attitude which always indicated deep thought with her, and pondered all the phases of her dilemma with the calm deliberation which invariably came to her in moments of great stress. "The only time Katherine is composed," Sawa had said once, "when she is in a pickle." And if Katherine was now in the biggest pickle she had ever experienced, by the same token her brain had never worked so coolly and logically before. When lost in the woods, she said to herself, going over in her mind her knowledge of woodcraft, the first thing to do is to climb a tree and get your bearings. That's all right for the woods, but there aren't any trees here to climb. I might climb a telegraph pole, she thought whimsically, as her eye fell upon one nearby, and see if I can locate myself. No, that wouldn't do, either, for the whole city is dark, and I couldn't see anything if I did get up. So much for rule number 1. Now for rule number 2. Establish your directions by observing and reading the signs of nature. Moss always grows on the north side of trees. Trees again, and telegraph poles won't do as substitutes this time. Moss doesn't grow on the north side of telegraph poles. There isn't any difference between the north side of a telegraph pole and any other. Katherine's train of thought was suddenly interrupted by her glance resting on the pole in question. One side of it, she could see in the light from the saloon, was glazed with ice where the driving rain had frozen in the chill wind. That wind was now coming from every direction, north, south, east and west, at once, and it was therefore impossible to judge from the whirling gusts which was none, but earlier in the evening, when the rain was falling, the wind had blown steadily from the north. Accordingly, the strip of ice on those poles carried the very same message as the moss on the trees in the woods. Katherine exclaimed aloud in delight at her discovery. In a twinkling she had her bearings. North, south, east, west, she said triumphantly, pointing in the 4 respective directions. Not a bad piece of scouting, that. What's the difference? Whether it's moss or ice, it's the same principle. Talk about your pole stars. I believe I know approximately where I am, she continued, her brain keeping up its logical working. We turned south from B Avenue to go to the music hall. I remember hearing Veronica say so, therefore, not yet having come to B Avenue in my wanderings, I must still be on the south side of it, and by going due north will come to it eventually. The way is as plain as the nose on your face, just follow the ice on the telegraph poles. I can feel it in places where it's too dark to see. All aboard for B Avenue. Katherine set off as fast as she could go through the darkness, whistling in her relief, and confidently keeping her feet pointed toward the north. As if acting upon the principle that the gods help them who help themselves, the street lights came on again just at that moment, showing up the comers and crossings, and making progress very much easier. She had gone some half-dozen blocks, and was once more passing the long row of gloomy, windowless warehouses which she remembered having seen before, when it became apparent to her alien senses that she was being followed. For the last 2 or 3 blocks she had heard the sound of a footfall behind her, turning the same comers she had turned, taking the same shortcut she had taken through a fact 01 yard, and gradually drawing nearer. Creak, creak, creak-a-creak. Through the still night air it sounded with startling distinctness, the same squeaking footfall that had passed her 10 minutes before, when she had crouched, with wildly beating heart, behind the fence in the dark alley. Filled with prophetic apprehension, she turned and looked around, and in the light of a street lamp several hundred yards behind her saw the figure that had loomed so large in her fears all evening. It required no second glance to recognize the long, light overcoat and the visor cap drawn low over the eyes. For an instant, Katherine's feeling of alarm held her rooted to the spot, even while she noticed that the man had increased his speed and the distance between them was rapidly lessening. Then the power of locomotion came back with a rush and she began to run. Her worst fears were confirmed when she heard the man behind her start to run also. Katherine doubled her speed and fled like a deer, slipping wildly over the icy sidewalk and expecting every minute to fall down, but by some miracle of good luck managing to retain her balance. Yet, run as she might, she realized that her pursuer was gaining. The footsteps pounding along behind her sounded nearer and nearer every minute. Her long coat, winding about her knees, caused her to slacken speed. Her breath began to give out, she developed an agonizing pain in her side. She knew that the race was lost, in a moment more she would be overtaken. She had just summoned breath for a last final spurt when she heard a crash behind her and the sound of a body falling on the sidewalk. She dashed on without slackening speed. The next minute she slipped on a sheet of ice in the middle of a crossing and fell headlong to the ground, just as a taxicab, coming out of the side street, turned the corner. Katherine heard a hoarse shout and the jamming of an emergency brake, then, before she had time to draw breath, the car was on top of her. A blinding light flashed for a moment in her eyes, her ears were filled with a deafening roar, then all of a sudden light and sound both ceased to be. Hearing came back first with returning consciousness. The roaring noise no longer sounded in her ears, and from somewhere, a long distance off, came the sound of a voice speaking. "Can't you lift the car? She's pinned underneath the wheels." "No, you can't back up, you'll run over her head. Don't you see it's right behind that left wheel? Got a jack in your toolbox? All right. Here, now." Gradually the weight that was pinning her to the ground was lifted, and she opened her eyes to find herself beside, and no longer under, the quivering monster with the hot breath. 3 figures were moving about her in the light of the headlamps, and now one of them knelt beside her and laid a hand on her head. "She isn't killed," said a voice which sounded strangely familiar in Katherine's ears, a voice which somehow carried her back to Carver House and the library fire. Carver House. Nyoda. Nyoda would be worried to death because she did not come home. Poor Nyoda, how sorry she would be about the watch. Unconsciously Katherine groaned aloud. "She must be pretty badly hurt," continued the voice beside her ear. "Help me lift her now and we'll get her into the car. A hand under her shoulders, so. I'll take her head. Easy now." Katherine felt herself being lifted from the ground and carried past the glare of the headlamps. Suddenly there came an explosive exclamation from one of the rescuers, the one who had done the talking, and the hand that supported her head trembled violently. "Good God! It's Katherine!" Katherine opened her eyes fully and looked up into the dumbfounded face of Sherry. "For Ian's sakes!" came an echoing exclamation from beside Sherry, and the black face of Hercules shone out in the light. "Hello, Sherry," said Katherine, in a voice which sounded strange in her own ears. Katherine, cried Sherry in terrified accents, are you badly hurt? LDONTKNOW, replied Katherine thickly, through a mouthful of fur from the collar of her coat. Guess not, she resumed, after Sherry had laid her on the back seat of the car. Nothing cracks when I wiggle it. My nose is skinned, she supplemented a minute later, and there's a comb sticking straight into my head. I guess that's all, breathed Sherry in immeasurable relief. It's a miracle you weren't killed. I thought sure you were. It looked as though both front wheels had gone over you. One went over my hat and the other over the tail of my coat, replied Katherine cheerfully. They just missed me by a hair's breadth. Are you sure your head isn't hurt? Sherry continued anxiously. You were unconscious when we lifted the car off of you, you know. Katherine solemnly felt her head all over. There is a bump there. No, that's my bump of generosity, it belongs there. Anyway, it doesn't hurt when I press it, so it must be all right, she assured him. Must have fainted, I guess, when the car came on top of me. It came so suddenly, and it made such a terrible noise. You can't think how awful it was. It must have been. A shudder went quivering through Sherry's frame at the thought of it. Can't get it out of my mind. I thought those wheels went right over you. It's nothing short of a miracle that they went on each side of you instead of over you, he said, repeating the sentiment he had just uttered a moment before. It all happened so quickly the driver didn't have a chance to turn aside. There was no one in sight 1 minute, and the next minute we were right on top of you. That driver out there's so scared he can't stand up on his legs yet. How did you happen to be in that taxicab? Katherine inquired curiously. We're on our way home, replied Sherry. We missed the Pennsylvania out of New York and had to take the nickel plate, which meant we had to change from one station to the other here in Philadelphia. We were going across in a taxi. So you were too late to catch Dr. Phillips, said Katherine soberly. Yes, replied Sherry gloomily. The boat had gone yesterday. How did Hercules stand the disappointment? Asked Katherine, with quick sympathy. He's pretty badly cut up about it, replied Sherry. He had quite a bad spell with his heart on the train. He says he's had a token that he'll never see Master Tad, as he calls him, again. I'm afraid he won't, myself. Even I've got a gloomy hunch that fate has the cards stacked against us this time. From Hercules' account, I don't think Dr. Phillips will live to reach South America. How unutterably tragic that would be, sighed Katherine, beginning to feel a load of world sorrow pressing on her heart. What a dismal business life was, to be sure. Sherry interrupted her doleful reverie. But tell me, Katherine, what, in the name of all that's fantastic, were you doing here in this neighborhood at this time of night? Katherine explained briefly, and in her overwrought state, burst into tears at the mention of the watch. And you say there was a footpad actually following you? Asked Sherry in consternation. You were running away from this man when you fell under the car? Where is he now? Katherine shook her head. Don't know. He slipped and fell just before I did, and I don't know what became of him after that. Sherry gave a long whistle, and, thrusting his head out of the taxi, gave a look around. There's a man coming up the street now, he said. He's limping badly. Is that the man? He's probably trying to slip away quietly in the excitement. Katherine raised her head and glanced out. That's the man, she exclaimed. He is the same one that followed me. Why, he is coming over here toward us, she said, in a tone of surprise. How queer. Is he going to hold us all up, I wonder? The man in the light overcoat, limping painfully, crossed the curb and approached the car standing, temporarily disabled, in the middle of the street. Sherry thrust out a belligerent face, at the same time looking, out of the tail of his eye, for his driver and Hercules. Both were out of sight, kneeling on the ground at the other side of the raised engine hood. The stranger limped up and hesitated before Sherry. Katherine, looking over Sherry's shoulder, noticing with a start of surprise that the man had snow-white hair. Although the long, light coat and the visor cap were the same as those she had seen on the man in the flower shop, this was an entirely different man. His blue eyes were mild and pensive, his whole bearing was gentle and retiring, and, standing there with the electric light behind him making a halo of his white hair, he looked like some little, old, melancholy saint. "The young lady that you just picked up," said the stranger in a voice mellow with old-fashioned courtesy, raising his cap politely. "I have been following her for some time, trying unsuccessfully to catch up with her. I saw her drop this bag on the street, some 2 hours ago, and since then have been attempting to restore it to her, but have not been able to reach her. As soon as I saw her drop the bag I picked it up and hurried after her, but she suddenly disappeared like a conjurer's trick. I walked around for some time, looking for her, when all of a sudden the street lights went out, and in the darkness I mistook my way and wandered down into the factory district, where it was not long before I was hopelessly lost. The only place that showed any signs of life was a saloon down on a corner, and, although I have my opinion of those places, sir, I went in and asked the proprietor the way out of the neighborhood. It was not long afterward that I saw this same young lady who had dropped the handbag not far ahead of me in the street, having evidently wandered down there in the darkness just as I had done. I hurried after her, but she became frightened and began to run. I ran, too, thinking to overtake her and explain the reason for my pursuit, but just when I was nearly up to her I slipped and fell on the sidewalk. I must have lain there stunned for several minutes, for when things had become clear again I saw this car standing here and you gentlemen carrying the young lady into it. She is not badly hurt, itnrst. Here is the bag I spoke of." He spied Katherine looking over Sherry's shoulder at that moment, and held out the handbag, again lifting his cap as he did so. At sight of the precious bag Katherine gave a shriek of joy, and seizing it with trembling fingers, looked inside to see if Nyoda's watch was still there. She almost sobbed with relief when her fingers closed upon the little velvet case, from which a faint ticking came to reassure her. "Then you aren't the man I saw in the flower shop at all," exclaimed Katherine, covered with confusion. "When I saw your light coat and that cap I was sure it was the same." The two men laughed heartily. "Isn't that just like a woman, though?" said Sherry. "They think that every man walking on the streets at night is a burglar, as a matter of course. It never occurs to them that an honest man could possibly have any business on the street after dark." "I'm awfully sorry," said Katherine sheepishly, "but I really was frightened to death when you began to run after me. You say you have been following me ever since I dropped the bag. Where did I drop it?" "Along by that iron fence on Th Street," answered the old. "That's where I was taken with the dizzy spell," said Katherine. "I must have dropped it without knowing it when I caught hold of the fence to steady myself." "But where did you go right after that?" asked the old man curiously. "You disappeared as suddenly as if the earth had swallowed you. I put up my umbrella for a few minutes to shield my face from the rain, and when I looked out from behind it you were nowhere in sight. That was where I went into the dark doorway of a church, and sat down to wait for the dizzy spell to wear off," replied Katherine. "I must have fallen asleep, for the first thing I knew a clock was striking 11:15. When I discovered the bag was gone I ran around like mad looking for it, and the first thing I knew I was lost, and the lights were out, and there I was down in those awful factory yards. I saw you coming out of that saloon and thought you were the man who had watched me take out some bills out of an inner pocket earlier this evening, and hid behind a fence until you had gone by. But fate evidently intended that our paths should cross again," resumed the old man, with the faint flicker of a smile on his pensive countenance, "for it was not long before you were just ahead of me again. The lights came on then, and I saw you plainly. And I saw you, and started to run," finished Katherine, joining in Sherry's burst of laughter. Just then Hercules straightened up from the ground and came around the front of the car. "Can we have yo pocket flasher, Mr. Shenhua?" he asked. Then his glance fell upon the stranger standing beside the car. His eyes started from their sockets, his jaw dropped, and for a moment he stood as if petrified. Then he gave a great gasp, and with a piercing cry of "Master Tad," he sank upon his knees at the old man's feet. Chapter 20. The end of a perfect day. "Daggers and dirks," exclaimed Sherry, weakly sitting down on the car step when it was finally borne in upon him that Katherine's highwayman was none other than Sylvia's father, Hercules Master Tad, the man for whom he and Hercules had been futilely fine-combing the earth for the last 24 hours. "Am I awake?" he continued, "or is this all an opium dream? First Katherine, whom we thought at home at Carver House, materializes before us out of thin air, then Dr. Phillips, whom we thought on a ship bound for South America. What's happening here tonight, anyway? Is it witchcraft?" "Oh, Master Tad," quavered Hercules, still on his knees, "we sure thought you was gone on that South America boat. We been a-looking for you so. Mr. Sheridan and I been down to New York all day." "You have been looking for me?" asked Dr. Phillips in surprise. Hercules, trying to tell the story all at once, became utterly incoherent in his excitement, and Shenhua saw that he would have to step in. And so there, in the light from the lamps of the disabled taxicab, with the fitful explosions of the reviving engine drowning out Shenhua's speech every few minutes, Tad Phillips heard the great news that would lift the crushing load of anguish from his heart, and would turn the world once more into a place of laughter, and light, and happiness. "It was a miracle, my deciding to stay over for the next boat," he declared solemnly, a few minutes later, after nearly wringing Sherry's hand off in an effort to express his joy and gratitude. "It was the hand of Providence, sir, nothing less than the hand of Providence. I had fully made up my mind to go on that boat yesterday, then for no reason at all I suddenly decided to wait until next week before sailing." His voice sank away into a whisper of awe as he repeated, "It was Providence itself, sir, nothing less than the hand of Providence, that made me change my mind about sailing yesterday." "You may have been inspired by Providence to change your mind about sailing," rejoined Sherry, "but if it hadn't been for Katherine, here, we never would have found you, for it never occurred to us that you were still in Philadelphia. It's all Katherine's doing, her losing that handbag. But if I hadn't eaten those lobster croquettes and gotten sick I wouldn't have lost the handbag," said Katherine comically. "It all comes back to the lobster croquettes. Providence and lobster croquettes. What a combination to work miracles." It was a rather disheveled, but altogether triumphant quartet that arrived at Carver House some few hours later. Katherine's hair had escaped from its net and hung in straggling wisps over her eyes. Her hat had been so completely crushed by its contact with the wheel of the taxi that it was unrecognizable as an article of millinery, and hung, a mere twisted piece of wreckage, in a dejected lump over one ear. Her coat was plastered with dirt from neck to hem, and her gloves were stiff and discolored. One eye was closed in a permanent wink by a black smudge that decorated her forehead and half of her cheek. Blissfully unconscious of her startling appearance, she burst into the library, where the household were waiting to welcome the returned wanderers. "Oh, Katherine," cried all the Winnebagos in chorus when they beheld her, "now you look natural again." The tale of Katherine's adventure, with its astonishing ending, left them all staring and breathless. "Katherine surely must have been born under a different sign of the zodiac than those you see in the ordinary almanacs," said Nyoda. "There is some special influence of planets guiding her that is denied to ordinary mortals. Must be the sign of the lobster," then laughed Katherine, gratefully sipping the hot milk Migwan had brought her, and allowing Justice to draw the hairpins from her hat and remove the battered wreck from her head. "How's Sylvia?" asked Sherry. "Very much improved," replied Nyoda, "but her heart is still acting queerly. I don't know how she is going to stand this excitement." Dr. Phillips agreed with her that he must not appear before Sylvia too suddenly, or the shock might be fatal. Impatient as he was for the recognition to take place, he knew that it would have to be brought about with caution. There was too much at stake to make a misstep now. Nyoda must prepare her gradually, first telling her that her father was alive, and letting her recover from the excitement of that announcement before breaking the news that he was actually in the house. The Winnebagos looked at Dr. Phillips with a surprise which it was difficult to conceal. This mild-eyed, white-haired gentleman was utterly different from the picture they had conjured up of the bold intender who had so determinedly made his entrance into Carver House. They had expected to see a grim-faced, resolute-looking man, and Himpaha confided afterward that her mental picture had included a pair of pistols sticking out of his pockets. The early portrait of Tad the Terror in Uncle Jasper's diary had been slightly misleading in regard to his appearance. Nyoda saw Dr. Phillips' eyes fixed, with a sorrowful expression, upon the portrait of Uncle Jasper above the library fireplace, and she guessed what bitter pangs the breaking up of that friendship had cost him, guessed also, that he had held no such bitter feeling against Jasper Carver as the master of Carver House had held against him, and understanding the characters of the two men, she saw why it was that Sylvia Warrington had preferred the one to the other. Over by the fireplace, Justice was teasing Katherine unmercifully about the lobster croquettes, while behind her back the captain had taken one of the broken feathers from her hat and was tickling Slim with it, who had fallen asleep in his chair. The clock on the stairway chimed 4. An irrepressible attack of yawning seized the whole party, and with one impulse the Winnebagos began to steal toward the stairway. "Well," said Katherine, with a sigh of deep content, as she went wearily up the stairs leaning on Migwan's shoulder, "well, this is the end of a perfect day." Chapter 21. Father and Daughter. In the morning Sylvia was so much better that Nyoda allowed her to sit up out of bed, and there, sitting beside the wheelchair which was to be the throne of the little princess all her life, she told Sylvia the story of her parentage. For a moment Sylvia sat as if turned to stone, then with a of unbelieving ecstasy, she clasped the picture of Sylvia Warrington to her hilt. "My mother." Nyoda stole out softly and left the two of them together. Later on in the afternoon there was a lively bustle of preparation in Sylvia's room. The great carved armchair that had served as throne on the night of the party had been brought up from the library, and once more covered with its tuple velvet draperies. Sylvia, whose romantic fancy had seized eagerly upon the immense dramatic possibilities of the occasion, had insisted upon being arrayed as the princess when her father should come in to see her. "The king is coming. The king is coming," she exclaimed every few moments. "Array me in my most splendid robes, for my royal father, the king, is coming." Thrills of excitement, like little needle pricks, ran up and down her spine, her whole being seemed alight with some wonderful inner radiance, that shone through the flesh and transfigured it with unearthly beauty. Nyoda brought the fairy-like white dress and draped it about her, playing the role of lady-in-waiting with spirit. Every time she passed before Sylvia she bowed low, she made the Winnebagos stand up in a line and pass in the bracelets from hand to hand, she herself brought in the crown on a cushion, and placed it upon Sylvia's head with much ceremony. "Doesn't she look like a real royal princess, though?" Migwan exclaimed to Himpaha in the far end off room. "I feel actually abashed before her, knowing all the while that it's only playing. Oh, if she could only have been cured." Himpaha sighed in answer. "How much jollier it would have been." Migwan echoed the sigh. "Life is very strange," she said musingly. "Things don't always come out the way we want them to." "That's so," said Himpaha, beginning to see a great many sober possibilities in life which had never before occurred to her. An automobile hum sounded outside. "There's Sherry now, bringing Dr. Phillips back from their ride," said Migwan. "They'll be coming up in a few minutes." The horn sounded again. "The royal trumpeter," cried Sylvia. "Our royal father, the king, approaches." She settled the crown more firmly upon her head, and sat up very straight on her throne. Her cheeks glowed like roses, her eyes were like great stars. Nyoda watched her keenly for any signs of being overcome with excitement. From the hall came the sound of footsteps. "His Majesty," the king said, Nyoda, throwing open the door with a dramatic flourish. For a moment Dr. Phillips stood transfixed upon the threshold, overcome by the scene of splendor within. Then he held out his arms to her, forgetting that she was paralyzed. "Sylvia, daughter." "Father." Then the amazing thing happened. Sylvia rose to her feet, stepped from the throne, and ran across the room into her father's arms. "It happens sometimes," explained Dr. Phillips a few moments later, when they had all recovered from their first stupefied amazement. "Some great shock, and the paralyzed nerves wake to life again. That is what has taken place here. She is cured." Chapter 22. One more toast. "To the Christmas adventure at Carver House," proposed Katherine, raising on high her glass of fruit punch. New Year's dinner was over, and they all stood in their places around the table, drinking toast after toast. "The Christmas adventure at Carver House," echoed the Winnebagos. "The best adventure we've had yet. Drink her down." The toast was drink with a will. Sylvia stood beside her father, her face one big sparkle, while a more subdued, but equally rapturous, gleam shone from the doctor's eye as he gazed on the adored child from whom he need never more be separated. The captain stood opposite Himpahara and gave her a long look as he touched her glass, as if he wished to fix every detail of her in his mind against the separation that was coming on the morrow. Slim also had his eyes turned toward Himpahara as he clicked glasses with Gladys across the table. Justice gave Katherine's glass a little nudge as he touched it, to attract her attention, for she had her face turned away from him toward Sylvia. Sawara's eye had a far-away look as she matched with Migwan. Nyoda and Sheni beamed impartially upon them all, and Hercules smacked his lips over his glass in the corner by himself. Hercules had abandoned his intention of dying, and announced that he was planning to get himself another goat, because life was too uneventful for a man of his vigor without something to fuss over and take up his time. "And it all happened because Katherine forgot Nyoda's name," said Sawara, setting her glass down. "Elle wasn't born in vain after all," laughed Katherine, meeting Justice's eye bent upon her in a close, quizzical scrutiny. "Which goes to prove," said Nyoda, "that everything has its use in this world, even our shortcomings. Let's celebrate that discovery. We have drunk to the memory of Uncle Jasper Carver and to the memory of Sylvia Warrington. We have drunk to the memory of the man who built Carver House with the secret passage. We have one swallow of punch left. Let's drink one more toast, not to the memory of Katherine Adams, but to her forgetter E." And amid a great shout of laughter the last toast was drunk. The end.